Gandalf rides to Isengard. He rides through the Gap of Rohan, past the watchtower of Orthanc rising from the plain like a black spike driven into the earth. And he rides because he needs help. Because the enemy is stirring. Because the ring has been found, or Gandalf suspects it has been found. And the world is about to change. And Gandalf needs the counsel of the being who knows more about the rings of power than anyone else alive. He rides to Saruman the White, the head of his order, the leader of the Astari, the wisest wizard in Middle-earth, a being of ancient origin and extraordinary knowledge, a counselor of kings, a scholar of the deep lore, the one person in all the world who should be able to help Gandalf understand what is happening and what must be done. And Gandalf arrives at Orthanc, and the doors close behind him. And the man who should be his greatest ally looks at him with cold, appraising eyes and says words that change everything. Against the power that has now arisen there is no victory. This is the moment. This is the hinge on which the story turns. The greatest wizard in Middle-earth, the being chosen by the Valar to lead the fight against Sauron, has switched sides. He has studied the enemy so thoroughly that he has become the enemy. He has gazed so long into the abyss that the abyss has gazed back, and the abyss has won. Tonight, I want to trace the full arc of that fall. From the beginning, from before the beginning, from the moment when a spirit named Kurumo was chosen for a sacred mission in the Blessed Realm, through the slow, centuries-long descent that turned the head of the Astari into a servant of the power he was sent to destroy. Because Saruman's fall is not sudden. It is not a single decision. It is a process, a gradual, step-by-step, psychologically precise process of corruption that is, I think, the most realistic and the most disturbing portrayal of moral failure in all of Tolkien's work. Stay with me. This is the story of how the wisest wizard in Middle-earth became one of its greatest villains, and what his fall tells us about the nature of pride, the danger of knowledge without humility, and the thin, terrifying line between studying evil and becoming it. Part 1. The Spirit of the Maker. Before he was Saruman, he was Kurumo. Before he was a wizard, he was a Maya, one of the angelic spirits who served the Valar in the Blessed Realm before the world was made. And the Valar he served was Ol. This matters. It matters more than most readers realize, because the connection between Kurumo and Ol is not incidental. It is the seed of everything, the origin of both Saruman's greatest strengths and his ultimate destruction. Ol is the smith, the maker, the Valar whose domain is craft, the shaping of materials, the creation of beautiful and useful things, the mastery of technique and knowledge in the service of building. All made the dwarves. All taught the Noldor the craft that produced the Silmarils and the Rings of Power. All's domain is the domain of the artisan, the engineer, the builder, the being who looks at raw material and sees what it could become, who takes the disordered and makes it ordered, who imposes design on chaos. Kurumo was a spirit of this domain. His nature was craft. His instinct was order. His deepest impulse was the desire to understand how things worked, to master the principles that governed the world, to acquire the knowledge that would allow him to shape reality according to his will. These qualities were, in their origin, good, genuinely, authentically good, aligned with the creative purpose of the Valar and oriented toward the betterment of the world. But these same qualities contained a vulnerability. The desire to master, to order, to impose design, these impulses can tip, under the right pressure, from creation to domination. The line between shaping raw material and shaping other beings is thin. The line between mastering a craft and mastering a people is thinner still. All himself crossed this line once, when he created the dwarves without Ilúvatar's permission, an act of creation that was also an act of presumption, a reaching beyond his appointed role. All repented. All recognized his error, offered to destroy what he had made, and was forgiven by Ilúvatar. But the impulse that led to the overreach, the impulse to create, to shape, to master, remained in all's nature. And it passed to his servants. There was another Maya of all, another spirit of the same domain, shaped by the same impulses, possessing the same gift for craft and the same vulnerability to the desire for mastery. That Maya's name was Myron. We know him as Sauron. Saruman and Sauron come from the same place. They served the same master. They were shaped by the same impulses. The connection is not a coincidence. It is the foundation of the entire tragedy. Curumo would eventually be sent to Middle-earth to oppose Sauron, and the being he was sent to oppose was, in the deepest sense, his brother. A dark reflection, a warning of what the craft impulse could become when it was not tempered by humility and love. Part 2. The mission. Around the year 1000 of the Third Age, the Valar made a decision. The shadow was growing in Middle-earth. Sauron, defeated at the end of the Second Age by the last alliance of elves and men, was returning, slowly, quietly, gathering strength in the darkness, preparing for the renewal of his war against the free peoples. And the Valar decided to send help, not armies, not divine interventions, not the overwhelming force that had destroyed Morgoth at the end of the First Age, and that had, in the process, devastated an entire continent. The Valar had learned from that experience. The War of Wrath, for all its necessity, had caused catastrophic collateral damage, sinking Beleriand, killing thousands, reshaping the geography of the world. The Valar would not repeat the mistake. This time they would send something subtler, advisors, guides, counselors who would help the free peoples find the strength to resist Sauron on their own. The Istari. 5 wizards, sent to Middle-earth in the bodies of old men, their divine power constrained, their angelic nature hidden, their mission defined not by what they could do, but by what they could inspire others to do. The Istari were not sent to fight Sauron. They were sent to help the peoples of Middle-earth fight Sauron. The distinction is critical. The wizards were advisors, not commanders. They were meant to inspire resistance, not to impose it. They were meant to strengthen the free will of the free peoples, not to replace it with their own. Curumo was chosen to lead this mission. He was selected by all, his master, his patron, the Valar whose nature he most fully embodied. Curumo was the most knowledgeable of the Maya who might be chosen. He was the most skilled. He was the most accomplished. A being of extraordinary intellectual capability, whose understanding of the principles of craft and power was unmatched among his peers. He was also, I think, the most ambitious. And this is where the seeds of the fall were planted, not in Middle-earth, not during the long centuries of the Third Age, but here, at the beginning in the Blessed Realm, in the moment of selection. Curumo was chosen to lead. And Curumo accepted the leadership as his due, as a recognition of his superiority, as a confirmation of his status, as an endorsement of his belief that he was, among the Istari, the best. Part 3. The one who did not want to go. There is a detail about the selection of the Istari that is easy to overlook, but that contains, in miniature, the entire tragedy that would unfold over the next 2,000 years. Gandalf did not want to go. Olrin, the Maya who would become Gandalf, was chosen for the mission by Mando, the chief of the Valar, with the particular urging of Varda, the Queen of the Stars. And Olrin said no. He said he was too weak. He said he was afraid of Sauron, afraid of the shadow, afraid that he was not strong enough for the task. This is extraordinary. A divine being, selected for a sacred mission by the highest authorities in the cosmos, confessing fear, confessing weakness, admitting, openly and without shame, that the task was beyond him. And Manu told him that this was precisely why he should go. The fear was not a disqualification. It was a qualification. The admission of weakness was not a sign of inadequacy. It was a sign of wisdom, the specific, humble, self-aware wisdom that the mission required. Kurumo did not say he was afraid. Kurumo did not confess weakness. Kurumo accepted the mission with confidence, the confidence of a being who believed in his own capability, who trusted his own knowledge, who was certain that his skills were equal to the task. And the confidence was not wrong, exactly. Kurumo was capable. He was knowledgeable. He was, by any objective measure, the most qualified candidate for the leadership of the Astari. But the confidence contained a flaw. The confidence was rooted in the self, in Kurumo's assessment of his own abilities, in his trust in his own judgment, in his belief that his personal qualities were sufficient to meet the challenge. Gandalf's fear was rooted in something different, in an awareness of the enormity of the task, in a recognition that individual capability was not enough, in a humility that left room for dependence on others and on powers greater than himself. The two attitudes, Saruman's confidence and Gandalf's fear, would define the two wizards' careers in Middle-earth. Saruman's confidence led him to trust his own judgment above all others, to rely on his own knowledge, to believe that he could handle Sauron's influence through the sheer force of his intellect. Gandalf's fear led him to seek allies, to trust hobbits, to rely on hope rather than certainty, to remain open to possibilities that his own understanding could not anticipate. Gandalf's fear saved him. Saruman's confidence destroyed him. Part 4. The Slight that Burned for 2,000 Years. When the Astari arrived in Middle-earth at the Grey Havens on the western coast, something happened that would poison Saruman's heart for the entirety of his time in the mortal world. Círdan the shipwright met the wizards at the harbour. Círdan was one of the oldest elves in Middle-earth, a being of extraordinary wisdom and perception, the keeper of the Grey Havens, the guardian of the ships that carried the elves to the Blessed Realm. And Círdan looked at the arriving Astari, and he made a judgment. Círdan had one of the 3 elven rings, Narya, the Ring of Fire, the ring whose power was the kindling of courage and the resistance of despair. Narya was one of the most important artifacts in Middle-earth, and Círdan had been its keeper for centuries. And Círdan gave Narya to Gandalf, not to Saruman, the leader, the chief, the being who held the highest rank and the greatest knowledge. To Gandalf, to the wizard who had confessed fear, who had admitted weakness, who arrived in Middle-earth not with the confidence of a leader, but with the humility of a servant. Círdan looked at the wizards and saw what the Valar saw, that Gandalf, for all his self-doubt, possessed a quality that Saruman lacked. Círdan perceived in Gandalf a depth of spirit, a capacity for compassion, a fundamental orientation toward others rather than toward himself, that made Gandalf the more suitable bearer of a ring, whose power was the kindling of hope. Saruman noticed. Of course, Saruman noticed. He was the leader. He was the chief. He was the being who had been selected by the Valar to head the Astari Order. And the elf at the dock had looked past him, had looked past the rank, the knowledge, the status, the formal authority, and had given the most precious object in his keeping to the wizard who stood behind him. The slight burned. It burned for 2,000 years. It burned because it was not merely a personal insult, it was a judgment. Círdan's gift said, "You are not the one. You have the rank, but not the quality. You have the knowledge, but not the wisdom. You are the head of the order, but this wizard behind you, this reluctant, self-doubting, afraid wizard, is the one who matters." Saruman never forgave the slight. And the resentment that it planted, the specific, pointed, deeply personal resentment of a being who has been told, through the language of a gift withheld, that he is not enough, became one of the driving forces of his corruption. Part 5. Saruman the White. Saruman settled in Middle-earth and began his work. He took the name Saruman, Curana, in the Elvish tongues, and he wore white, the colour of his order, the colour that signified his rank as the head of the Astari. He was Saruman the White, the greatest of the wizards, the counsellor of kings. For centuries, Saruman was good. This is important to establish, because the tragedy of his fall requires us to understand what was lost. Saruman was not always corrupt. He was not always the cold-eyed manipulator who imprisoned Gandalf in Orthanc. He was, for a long time, a genuine force for good in Middle-earth, a being who used his knowledge and his skill in the service of the free peoples, who advised and guided, who contributed to the resistance against the growing shadow. Saruman travelled widely. He studied the peoples and the lands of Middle-earth with the thoroughness that his nature demanded. He learned languages, he mastered histories, he accumulated knowledge, vast, deep, comprehensive knowledge of the world and its workings, of the forces at play, of the strategies and the capabilities of both the free peoples and the enemy. And Saruman was respected. He was respected by the elves who recognized his learning. He was respected by the men of Gondor who valued his counsel. He was respected by the other Astari who deferred to his leadership. Saruman's authority was real, earned through centuries of service, built on a foundation of genuine accomplishment, supported by the visible evidence of his extraordinary capability. But respect was not enough. Respect is what others give you. Saruman wanted something more, something that comes from within rather than from without, something that confirms not just your value to others, but your value to yourself. Saruman wanted to be right. He wanted to be the one who understood the situation more clearly than anyone else, who saw the truth that others missed, who possessed the vision that would save the world. This desire, the desire to be right, to be the most perceptive, to be the indispensable mind, is not obviously evil. It is, in many people, the engine of genuine achievement. But in Saruman, the desire was not balanced by the humility that would have allowed him to question his own conclusions. Saruman assumed that his understanding was correct because it was his. The man who never doubted his ability to handle the mission was also the man who never doubted his ability to interpret the world, and the interpretations, unchecked by doubt, would eventually lead him to conclusions that were catastrophic. Part 6. The Tower of Orthanc. In the year 2759 of the Third Age, Saruman took up residence in Isengard, the great fortress at the southern end of the Misty Mountains, built by the Númenóreans in the early days of Gondor's power. At the centre of Isengard stood Orthanc, the Tower of Orthanc, a spike of black rock that rose 500 feet above the surrounding plain, impervious to weather and to war, a masterwork of Númenórean craft. The steward of Gondor gave Saruman the keys to Orthanc. Saruman was, by this point, a trusted counsellor of the Dnedain, a being whose wisdom and whose commitment to the defence of the West had been demonstrated over centuries. The gift of Orthanc was an act of trust, a recognition that Saruman's presence at this strategic location, guarding the Gap of Rohan and watching the approaches to Mordor, would serve the interests of the free peoples. And for a time, It did. Saruman used Orthanc as his base, a seat of learning and of watchfulness, a place from which he could monitor the movements of the enemy and coordinate the defense of the West. The tower served the purpose for which it was given. But the tower also changed Saruman. A tower is a statement. A tower says, I am above. I am separate. I look down on the world from a height that others cannot reach. The Tower of Orthanc, with its black stone and its impregnable walls and its commanding view of the surrounding landscape, reinforced the tendencies in Saruman's character that were already pushing him toward isolation and toward pride. The tower was his. The fortress was his. The ring of stone that encircled Isengard was his domain, a controlled environment, ordered according to his design, governed by his will. Saruman was building a kingdom, not openly, not consciously, not with the deliberate intention of establishing a rival power. But the accumulation of resources, the tower, the fortress, the knowledge, the relationships, the influence, was creating something that looked, from the outside, increasingly like an independent domain, rather than a councillor's residence. The tower also contained something that Saruman did not know about when he took possession, or that he discovered later and recognized with a thrill of dangerous excitement. In the Tower of Orthanc, hidden in its chambers, was one of the Palantri, the seeing stones of Menor, the ancient communication devices that allowed the user to see across vast distances and to communicate with other Palanta users. Saruman did not reveal this discovery. He kept the Palanta secret, one more possession hoarded, one more resource concealed. One more instrument of power gathered into the private arsenal that Saruman was building behind the public facade of service to the free peoples. The secrecy was itself a corruption. The Palantri were not personal property. They were national resources, instruments that had been made for the use of the faithful, that had been distributed among the kingdoms for the common good. That should have been disclosed to the steward of Gondor or to the White Council as a strategic asset. Saruman kept it because Saruman wanted it. Not for the mission, not for the common defense, for himself. The Palanta was knowledge. The Palanta was sight. The Palanta was the ability to see what others could not see, to know what others did not know, to maintain the informational advantage that was the currency of Saruman's self-worth. Sharing the Palanta would have diminished the advantage, and diminishing the advantage was something Saruman could not tolerate. The Palantir of Orthanc would become the instrument of Saruman's final corruption. But before the Palantir did its work, the groundwork had been laid, the pride, the isolation, the accumulation of power, the growing conviction that Saruman's judgment was infallible and Saruman's knowledge was supreme. The Palantir did not corrupt Saruman. The Palantir accelerated a corruption that was already underway. Part 7. The Study of the Enemy. Saruman began to study the Rings of Power. This was, in principle, a reasonable and even necessary undertaking. The Astari had been sent to oppose Sauron. Sauron's power was rooted in the rings, in the One Ring which he had made, and in the lesser rings which he had helped to create. Understanding the rings was essential to understanding the enemy. Studying the rings was part of the job. But the study consumed Saruman. It became his primary occupation, his obsession, his defining intellectual passion, the subject that drew more and more of his attention and energy until it crowded out almost everything else. Saruman did not merely study the rings. He immersed himself in ring lore. He read every text. He consulted every source. He traced every historical thread. He became, over the centuries, the foremost authority on the rings of power in Middle-earth, more knowledgeable than the elves, more informed than Gandalf, more expert than any other living being. The study was impressive. It was also dangerous. Because the study of the rings is in a very specific way the study of Sauron. The rings are expressions of Sauron's craft and Sauron's will. They embody Sauron's philosophy, the philosophy of domination, of control, of the imposition of one will on other wills. To study the rings is to study the principles of domination. To understand the rings is to understand how domination works, how it is achieved, how it is maintained, how it is refined and perfected. And Saruman, the mire of all, the being whose nature was oriented toward understanding how things work and mastering the principles that govern them, Saruman found the study fascinating. He was drawn to the rings not only because they were relevant to his mission, but because they were, in the deepest sense, objects that appealed to his nature. The rings were craft. They were knowledge made physical. They were the supreme expression of the artisan's power, the power to take raw material and shape it into an instrument of will. The study did not make Saruman evil, but the study changed the way Saruman thought about power. Before the study, Saruman understood power as a tool, a means to an end, an instrument to be used in the service of a larger purpose. After centuries of immersion in ring lore, Saruman began to understand power as a craft, a discipline to be mastered, a skill to be refined, a domain of knowledge that was valuable in itself, independent of the purposes it served. The shift was subtle, almost invisible. But it was the shift that made everything else possible, the shift from power as tool to power as art, from the study of evil to the appreciation of evil's methods, from understanding how the enemy worked to admiring how the enemy worked. Consider what the study involved. To understand ring lore, Saruman had to understand the principles of domination, the specific techniques by which a ring of power could capture and control a will. He had to understand the metallurgy, the alchemical and spiritual processes that could bind a spirit to a physical object. He had to understand the psychology, the desires and the vulnerabilities that made a bearer susceptible to a ring's influence. He had to understand, in the most intimate and detailed sense, how Sauron thought, what Sauron valued, what Sauron feared, what principles Sauron operated by. And the understanding required empathy. Not moral empathy, not the compassionate other-oriented empathy that Gandalf practiced. Cognitive empathy. The empathy of the analyst. The ability to place yourself inside the mind of the being you are studying, to see the world as Sauron sees it, to think as Sauron thinks, to understand the logic of domination from the inside. The cognitive empathy was dangerous because it was seductive. When you spend centuries inside the mind of a being who believes that domination is the natural order of the world, when you understand, from the inside, the logic that makes domination seem reasonable, the arguments that make tyranny seem efficient, the worldview that makes the enslavement of other wills seem like a form of order rather than a form of violence, the understanding changes you. Not because you agree with the conclusions, but because the familiarity breeds comfort. The logic that seemed alien at first becomes familiar. The arguments that seemed repugnant at first become interesting. The worldview that seemed evil at first begins to seem compelling. Saruman spent centuries inside Sauron's mind, and the centuries of habitation left their mark. Saruman did not consciously adopt Sauron's worldview. He absorbed it, gradually, osmotically, through the sustained exposure to a way of thinking that was, at its core, oriented toward the same impulses that Saruman's own nature already contained. The craft impulse, the mastery impulse, the desire to order and to control. Sauron's worldview was Saruman's worldview, amplified and unrestrained, and the familiarity made the amplification feel less like corruption and more like clarity. Part 8. The Gladden Fields. There is a detail in Tolkien's writings that reveals the depth of Saruman's corruption long before the corruption became visible to others. A detail that shows us the moment when Saruman's study of the rings crossed the line from research into covetousness. Saruman searched for the One Ring, not openly, not publicly, not in a way that would have alerted the other members of the White Council or the leaders of the Free Peoples. Saruman searched for the ring in secret, sending servants to the Gladden Fields, the marshlands near the Anduin where Isildur had been killed and where the ring had been lost nearly 2,000 years earlier. Saruman knew that the ring was somewhere in the Gladden Fields. He knew the history, knew that Isildur had cut the ring from Sauron's hand at the end of the Second Age, had kept it, and had lost it when he was ambushed by orcs on the banks of the Anduin. The ring had slipped from Isildur's finger and fallen into the river, and there it had remained, lost, hidden, waiting, and Saruman wanted it. This desire, the desire for the ring itself, not merely the desire to understand the ring, was the decisive turning point. Everything before this could be explained as intellectual curiosity, as professional thoroughness, as the diligence of a scholar pursuing his subject to its natural conclusion. But the search for the ring was not scholarship. It was ambition. Saruman was not looking for the ring in order to destroy it. He was looking for the ring in order to use it. The desire was, I think, rooted in the same impulse that drove all to create the dwarves. The impulse to make, to shape, to impose order on the world through the exercise of craft. The ring was the supreme instrument of craft. The ring was the ultimate tool, the device that could bend wills, shape destinies, and impose the bearer's design on the entire world. For a being whose deepest nature was oriented toward mastery and order, the ring was irresistible. Saruman did not find the ring. The ring had long since been found by Gollum, who carried it into the tunnels under the Misty Mountains, and then by Bilbo, who carried it to the Shire. Saruman's search produced nothing, but the search itself was the revelation, the proof that the head of the Istari, the being sent by the Valar to oppose Sauron, was no longer interested in opposing Sauron's methods. He was interested in adopting them. The search also reveals how far Saruman had drifted from his original purpose, because the purpose of the Istari was not to acquire power. The purpose was to resist power. The Istari were specifically forbidden from matching Sauron's power with power of their own. They were sent in diminished forms, old men, not angels, precisely because the Valar did not want the Istari to rely on force. The mission was to inspire, to counsel, to help the Free Peoples find their own strength. The mission was emphatically not to find the One Ring and use it. Saruman's ring search was a betrayal of the mandate at the most fundamental level. He was not merely failing to oppose Sauron. He was trying to become a second Sauron, a ring lord, a bearer of the instrument of domination, a master of the device that was designed to enslave every will in the world. The search was the point at which Saruman's corruption ceased to be a matter of attitude and became a matter of action. The point at which the internal drift of pride and ambition expressed itself in concrete, operational behavior. And the search was secret. This is perhaps the most telling detail. Saruman did not announce his intentions. He did not bring the search before the White Council for discussion. He did not seek the approval or the input of his colleagues. He acted alone, in secret, knowing that what he was doing would not survive scrutiny, knowing that if the other members of the council discovered what he was doing, they would recognize it for what it was, a betrayal of everything the Istari were sent to do. The secrecy was the confession. Saruman knew that the search was wrong. He knew it because he hid it. A person who believes that their actions are justified does not conceal them. A person who conceals their actions knows, at some level, that the actions cannot be justified. Saruman's secrecy was the proof that the corruption had not yet consumed his moral awareness, that somewhere inside the fallen wizard, the being who had been sent to Middle-earth for a sacred purpose, still knew the difference between right and wrong. He just chose wrong anyway. Part 9. The White Council. The White Council was formed in the year 2463 of the Third Age, a council of the wise, comprising the greatest elf lords and the Astari, established to coordinate the defense against Sauron's growing influence, and Saruman was chosen to lead it. But Galadriel had wanted Gandalf. This is the second slight, the second time that someone in a position of authority looked past Saruman and toward Gandalf. The second time that the hierarchy of the Astari was questioned by someone who perceived in Gandalf a quality that Saruman lacked. Galadriel, the Lady of Lothlorien, the most powerful and the most perceptive of the elves who remained in Middle-earth, wanted Gandalf to lead the White Council. Galadriel saw what Círdan had seen, what Mandu had seen, what Varda had seen. Gandalf was the one who mattered. Saruman was chosen anyway. He was chosen because his knowledge was greater, because his formal rank was higher, because the other members of the council deferred to the established hierarchy. But the fact that Galadriel wanted Gandalf, the fact that the wisest elf in Middle-earth preferred the second wizard to the first, was another splinter in Saruman's pride. Another reminder that his position was not as secure as he believed. Another piece of evidence that the universe was conspiring to elevate Gandalf at Saruman's expense. And as head of the White Council, Saruman made a decision that would define the next 5 centuries. He argued against attacking Dol Guldur. Dol Guldur was the fortress in southern Mirkwood where a dark power had established itself. Gandalf had investigated and had determined that the dark power was Sauron himself, returned to Middle-earth, gathering strength, preparing for the renewal of his war. Gandalf urged the council to attack Dol Guldur immediately, to strike while Sauron was still relatively weak, to drive him out before he could consolidate his power. Saruman overruled him. Saruman argued that the One Ring had been lost in the Anduin and would eventually be washed out to sea, making Sauron's return to full power impossible. He argued that waiting was safer than acting, that patience was wiser than haste, that the council should watch and wait rather than risk a premature assault. The argument was plausible. It was even, on the surface, reasonable, but the argument was also self-serving, because Saruman was, at this time, secretly searching the Gladden Fields for the ring. Saruman did not want the council to attack Dol Guldur because Saruman did not want the council to interfere with his search. He needed time. He needed the ring to remain lost, to remain available for his own discovery, before Sauron could reclaim it. Saruman was using his position as head of the White Council to protect his private agenda. The being who was supposed to lead the fight against Sauron was sabotaging the fight against Sauron in order to pursue his own designs on the ring. The sabotage went on for decades. From the formation of the council in 2463 until Saruman finally agreed to the attack on Dol Guldur in 2941, Saruman repeatedly delayed action, arguing for patience, counseling restraint, presenting the strategic case for waiting. And the waiting served Saruman's purposes. Every year of delay was another year for Saruman's agents to search the Gladden Fields. Every postponed assault was another opportunity for Saruman to find the ring before Sauron could reclaim it. When Saruman finally consented to the attack on Dol Guldur in 2941, it was because he had learned that Sauron was also searching the Gladden Fields, that the Dark Lord's servants had been spotted in the area, that Sauron was seeking the ring in the same location that Saruman was seeking it. The attack on Dol Guldur was not, for Saruman, a strategic victory against the enemy. It was a competitive move, an action taken not to defeat Sauron, but to disrupt Sauron's search, and to preserve Saruman's own chance of finding the ring first. The corruption of the White Council is one of the most chilling aspects of Saruman's fall. The Council was the highest body of the wise, the supreme deliberative organ of the free peoples, the place where the greatest minds in Middle-earth gathered to discuss the most important questions of the age. And Saruman corrupted it. He turned the Council from an instrument of collective defense into an instrument of personal ambition, using his position as chairman to steer the discussion, to suppress inconvenient proposals, to redirect the Council's energy away from the common good and toward his private interests. The corruption was invisible to the other members. They trusted Saruman. They deferred to his judgment. They believed that his arguments for patience were sincere, that the wizard who led the council was acting in good faith, that his strategic assessments were honest, that his council reflected the best interests of the free peoples. They did not know about the agents in the Gladden Fields. They did not know about the ring search. They did not know that the being they trusted was using their trust as a shield for his own ambitions. Part 10. The jealousy. Saruman's jealousy of Gandalf was not a single emotion. It was a complex, layered, slowly evolving resentment that grew over the centuries like a vine strangling the trunk of a tree. The jealousy had many components. There was professional jealousy, the resentment of a being who held the highest rank, but who watched a subordinate receive the greater trust. There was intellectual jealousy, the frustration of a scholar who possessed more knowledge than Gandalf, but who was consistently outperformed by Gandalf's intuition and wisdom. There was social jealousy, the irritation of a leader who watched his subordinate form deeper, more genuine, more lasting relationships with the peoples of Middle-earth than Saruman himself had managed to achieve. Gandalf was loved. This is the simple, devastating truth that Saruman could not escape. Gandalf was loved by the hobbits, by the elves, by the men of Gondor and Rohan, by the dwarves, by everyone who encountered him. Gandalf was loved not because he was powerful, but because he was kind, because he was warm, because he treated people, all people, regardless of their importance or their usefulness, with genuine interest and genuine respect. Consider what Gandalf did with his time. He visited the Shire. He set off fireworks for hobbit children. He sat in Bag End and smoked pipeweed with Bilbo and discussed the finer points of Elvish grammar. He walked the roads of Middle-earth not like a dignitary on an inspection tour, but like a friend making the rounds, stopping in, checking on people, sharing a meal, telling a story, listening to the concerns of beings that any self-respecting cosmic emissary would have considered beneath his notice. Gandalf was present. He was available. He was, in the deepest sense, with the people he served, not above them, not apart from them, not observing them from the height of a tower, but among them, walking their roads, sharing their food, learning their songs, taking pleasure in their company. Saruman was respected. He was consulted. He was deferred to. But Saruman was not loved. His relationships were transactional, built on the exchange of knowledge for influence, of counsel for access, of expertise for status. Saruman's relationships served his purposes. Gandalf's relationships served the people he related to. And the difference, the visible, undeniable, impossible to ignore difference between being respected and being loved, ate at Saruman for centuries. The jealousy expressed itself in small ways at first. A dismissive comment about Gandalf's hobbit friends. A patronizing remark about Gandalf's habit of spending time with lesser peoples. A subtle undermining of Gandalf's proposals in the White Council. Not outright opposition, but the careful, deniable, plausibly innocent redirection of discussion away from Gandalf's ideas and towards Saruman's own. Over time, the jealousy hardened into contempt. Saruman did not merely resent Gandalf. He began to despise Gandalf, to view Gandalf's warmth as weakness, Gandalf's humility as foolishness, Gandalf's love for the small and the ordinary as a failure of vision. Saruman looked at Gandalf and saw a waste of talent, a being of genuine power who squandered that power on pipe smoking and fireworks and the conversation of halflings. The contempt was a defense mechanism. Saruman could not bear the possibility that Gandalf was right, that warmth and humility and love for the small were not weaknesses but strengths, that the way Gandalf operated was not inferior to Saruman's way but superior. If Gandalf was right, then Saruman was wrong. If Gandalf's approach was better, then Saruman's approach was worse. And Saruman could not accept this. His identity, his self-worth, his entire understanding of his own value was built on the conviction that his way, the way of knowledge, of mastery, of the rational analysis of power, was the correct way. To admit that Gandalf's way was better was to admit that Saruman's life had been a mistake. So Saruman chose contempt. Contempt was easier than self-examination. Contempt was more comfortable than humility. Contempt allowed Saruman to maintain his self-image intact, to continue believing that he was the greater wizard, that his approach was the correct approach, that his failures were the result of external circumstances rather than internal deficiencies. Part 11. The pipeweed. There is a small, almost comic detail in The Lord of the Rings that reveals the depth and the pettiness of Saruman's jealousy, and the detail is pipeweed. Saruman smoked pipeweed. He smoked it in secret. He obtained it from the Shire, the very place that Gandalf loved, the home of the halflings that Saruman affected to despise. Saruman had his agents purchase pipeweed from the hobbits and ship it to Isengard, where Saruman smoked it in the privacy of his chambers, concealing the habit from the other Istari and from the members of the White Council. The pipeweed is revealing because it shows us that Saruman's contempt for Gandalf's hobbit friends was not genuine. It was a performance. Underneath the contempt, Saruman was fascinated by the things that Gandalf valued, fascinated and envious. He wanted what Gandalf had. He wanted the pleasures, the connections, the simple enjoyments that Gandalf found among the hobbits. But he could not admit the wanting, because the admission would undermine his entire self-image as a being above such ordinary concerns. So Saruman did in private what he mocked in public. He smoked the pipeweed while sneering at the pipe smoker. He imported the pleasures of the Shire while despising the Shire. He copied Gandalf while condemning Gandalf. The hypocrisy is so complete and so petty that it would be funny if it were not so sad. The portrait of a man who has spent centuries building a persona of intellectual superiority and who cannot admit, even to himself, that the person he looks down on has something he wants. The pipeweed also tells us that Saruman was paying attention to the Shire long before the War of the Ring. His agents were already operating in the Hobbit's homeland. His network of informants and suppliers was already established. The groundwork for the scouring of the Shire, the final, most degraded expression of Saruman's corruption, was being laid while Saruman was still nominally a member of the White Council, still nominally a defender of the free peoples, still nominally the leader of the fight against Sauron. Part 12. The Palantir of Orthanc, the Seeing Stone. The instrument that completed Saruman's corruption and delivered him into Sauron's influence. The Palantri were ancient, crafted by Fëanor in the Elder Days, brought to Middle-earth by the faithful Númenóreans, distributed among the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor as tools of communication and surveillance. The stones allowed their users to see across vast distances, to communicate with other stone users, and to observe events in remote locations. They were, in modern terms, a network. A system of linked devices that allowed the leaders of the Nadain to maintain awareness and coordination across their far-flung realms. The Palantir of Orthanc was one of the surviving stones. Saruman found it in the tower, or perhaps he knew it was there, and took up residence in Orthanc specifically because of the stone's presence. Either way, the Palantir became a part of Saruman's operation, a tool that allowed him to see, to watch, to monitor the world from his tower. And at some point, the text does not give us a precise date, but the implication is that it happened relatively late in Saruman's career. Probably in the decades before the War of the Ring, Saruman looked into the Palantir and saw Sauron looking back. This is the moment that the films capture brilliantly. The moment when the seeing stone, which should have been a tool of surveillance, becomes a tool of entrapment. Saruman looked into the Palantir to see the world, and instead of seeing the world, he saw the eye. The encounter would have been terrifying. Sauron's will projected through the Palantir was overwhelming. The focused, concentrated, millennia-old will of a fallen Maya whose entire existence had been oriented toward domination. Saruman was powerful. Saruman was knowledgeable. Saruman was, by any measure, one of the most formidable beings in Middle-earth. And Saruman was outmatched. The will that stared back at him through the stone was stronger than his own, not by a small margin, but by an order of magnitude. The difference between a craftsman and the master craftsman, between the student and the teacher, between the being who studied power and the being who embodied it. The encounter did not break Saruman the way a siege engine breaks a wall. It did something subtler and more insidious. It confirmed his fears. Saruman had been studying Sauron for centuries. He had been calculating the balance of forces. He had been running the numbers, assessing Sauron's strength, comparing it with the strength of the free peoples, computing the probability of victory. And the encounter with Sauron's will through the Palantir confirmed what the numbers had been suggesting. Sauron was stronger. Sauron was going to win. The free peoples, for all their courage and their alliances and their determination, did not have the strength to overcome the power that was rising in Mordor. The confirmation was devastating because it was experiential rather than theoretical. Before the Palantir, Saruman's assessment of Sauron's power was based on data, on reports, on histories, on the rational analysis of observable facts. After the Palantir, the assessment was based on contact, on the direct personal, visceral experience of meeting Sauron's will and feeling it overwhelm his own. The data could be questioned. The experience could not. The Palantiri were not evil. They were tools, neutral instruments that could be used by anyone with the will and the strength to operate them. But the stones were also connected to each other, and the stone that Sauron possessed, a Palantir that had been captured from Minas Ithil when it fell to the Nazgul, was linked to the other surviving stones. When Saruman looked into the Palantir of Orthanc, his gaze met Sauron's gaze through the connected network of stones. And Sauron was stronger. Sauron's will was more powerful than Saruman's. Sauron's mastery of the Palantiri was more complete. Sauron could control what Saruman saw, could shape the visions, could filter the information, could present a version of reality that was designed to manipulate Saruman's perceptions and Saruman's decisions. The Palantir did not suddenly convert Saruman to evil. It worked on him gradually, feeding him selected information, showing him the scope of Sauron's power while concealing its weaknesses, creating the impression that Sauron's victory was inevitable and that resistance was futile. The Palantir was a propaganda machine. Sauron was the propagandist. And Saruman, for all his intelligence, for all his knowledge, for all his centuries of experience, Saruman was the audience. The irony is devastating. Saruman, The being who prided himself on his superior understanding of power was being manipulated by power. Saruman, the scholar who had spent centuries studying the methods of domination, was being dominated. Saruman, the wizard who believed that his intellect made him immune to the very forces he studied, was proving, through the simple fact of his manipulation, that intellect without humility is the easiest thing in the world to exploit. Part 13. The logic of surrender. The Palantir showed Saruman what Sauron wanted him to see: the overwhelming scope of Sauron's power. The vast armies, the fortresses, the allies, the Easterlings, the Southrons, the Corsairs, the 1,000 tributaries and vassals of the Dark Lord's empire. Sauron showed Saruman the mathematics of the situation, the calculation of forces, the comparison of armies, the cold, rational, strategically defensible conclusion that the free peoples could not win. And Saruman, the rational being, the being who trusted his own analysis above all other sources of truth, accepted the mathematics. Saruman looked at the numbers and concluded that Sauron was right. The free peoples could not win. The armies of the West were too small, the alliances were too fragile, the leadership was too divided, the resources were too thin. By every measurable standard, by every standard that Saruman's analytical mind could apply, Sauron's victory was inevitable. The conclusion was wrong. But it was wrong in a way that Saruman's intelligence could not detect, because the variables that would ultimately determine the outcome of the war were variables that Saruman's worldview could not accommodate. Two hobbits carrying a ring to a volcano, a creature named Gollum biting a finger on the edge of a cliff, an eagle catching a falling halfling. The variables that saved the world were the variables that Saruman's analysis excluded. The small, the unlikely, the apparently insignificant. The variables that operated outside the framework of power and strategy and rational calculation. Saruman could not see these variables because Saruman did not believe in them. Saruman believed in power. Saruman believed in force. Saruman believed in the rational analysis of capabilities and the logical deduction of outcomes. And within the framework of power and force and rational analysis, Sauron's victory was certain. The logic of surrender followed inevitably. If Sauron could not be defeated, then the only rational course of action was to join him, to position oneself on the winning side, to negotiate the best possible terms, to preserve what could be preserved by allying with the power that could not be resisted. This was not cowardice in Saruman's view. It was realism. It was the mature, pragmatic, clear-eyed assessment of a situation that sentimentality and wishful thinking could not change. The logic was seductive because it was logical. It made sense. It was supported by evidence. It was the kind of argument that intelligent people find compelling, the kind of argument that flatters the intelligence of the person who accepts it, that makes the acceptance feel like wisdom rather than surrender. Saruman did not feel like he was betraying his mission. He felt like he was adapting his mission to reality. The mission was to oppose Sauron. Sauron could not be opposed. Therefore, the mission required a new approach, an approach that worked within the constraints of reality rather than against them. The new approach was collaboration, partnership, the sharing of power. Saruman would join Sauron, not as a servant, not as a slave, but as a partner, as a colleague, as a co-ruler of the new order that Sauron's victory would create. Saruman's knowledge and Sauron's power combined would produce a dominion more complete and more enduring than either could achieve alone. This was, of course, a fantasy. Sauron did not share power. Sauron did not accept partners. Sauron used people and discarded them. The partnership that Saruman imagined was a delusion, a story that Saruman told himself to make the surrender palatable, to disguise the capitulation as a strategic repositioning, to maintain the fiction that Saruman was still in control of his own destiny. Part 14. The Colours. There is a moment in Gandalf's account of his visit to Orthanc that crystallizes the transformation, a moment that is small and strange and deeply revealing. Saruman's robes change colour. When Gandalf arrives at Orthanc, he finds Saruman wearing robes that are no longer white. They are not any single colour. They shift, they shimmer, they display all the colours of the spectrum, changing as Saruman moves. And Saruman presents this change as an improvement, an evolution, an advancement beyond the limitations of the white that he previously wore. White, Saruman says with contempt. It serves as a beginning. White cloth may be dyed, the white page can be overwritten, and the white light can be broken. Gandalf's response is devastating, in which case it is no longer white. And he that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom. The exchange is about more than robes. It is about identity. Saruman the White was defined by his colour, by the purity of purpose, the clarity of mission, the unambiguous commitment to the light that the white robes represented. Saruman of many colours has abandoned that definition. He has replaced the singular, clear, unambiguous white with a multiplicity of colours that represent not richness, but confusion, not advancement, but dissolution, not evolution, but decay. Saruman thinks the colours are an improvement because Saruman has lost the capacity to understand simplicity. His mind, overcomplicated by centuries of study and analysis and strategic calculation, can no longer appreciate the value of a single, clear purpose. The white was too simple. The white did not allow for the nuance, the flexibility, the strategic adaptability that Saruman's increasingly complex worldview required. The many colours represent Saruman's belief that he has transcended the limitations of his original mission, that he is now more sophisticated, more capable, more evolved than the being who wore white. But Gandalf sees the truth. Gandalf sees that the many colours are not an improvement, but a loss. The white was whole. The many colours are fragments, pieces of a broken whole, shards of a shattered unity, the remnants of a purpose that has been pulled apart by the centrifugal force of competing ambitions and conflicting loyalties. Saruman has broken the white light, and the broken light, for all its pretty colours, is less than the white from which it came. Part 15. The Offer. Gandalf is in Orthanc. The doors are closed. Saruman stands before him, no longer the leader he followed, no longer the colleague he trusted, no longer the being whose judgment he respected. Saruman stands before Gandalf as something new, a tempter, a recruiter, a salesman offering a product that Gandalf does not want. The offer is remarkable for what it reveals about Saruman's state of mind. Saruman does not threaten Gandalf. He does not command. He does not use force. He persuades. He presents his case, the case for joining Sauron, the case for abandoning the resistance, the case for accepting the inevitable and positioning themselves on the winning side. A new power is rising, Saruman says. Against it, the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. There is no hope left in elves or dying Menor. This then is one choice before you, before us. We may join with that power. The language is careful. One choice before you, before us. Saruman is not ordering Gandalf. He is including Gandalf, making Gandalf a participant in the decision, framing the surrender as a shared strategic assessment rather than a unilateral capitulation. The language is designed to make Gandalf feel that the decision is rational, that the conclusion is inescapable, that any intelligent being would reach the same assessment. And then Saruman goes further. He suggests that they could, eventually, direct the new power, that they could join Sauron initially, but work toward their own purposes in the long run, using Sauron's victory as a platform for their own ambitions. We can bide our time, Saruman says. We can keep our thoughts in our hearts, deploring maybe evils done by the way, but approving the high and ultimate purpose: knowledge, rule, order. Knowledge, rule, order. These are the values that Saruman has always held. The values of the craftsman, the builder, the organizer. But the values have been perverted. Knowledge has become surveillance. Rule has become domination. Order has become control. The words are the same. The meanings have shifted, rotated by slow degrees, from the creative to the destructive, from the benevolent to the tyrannical, from the servant's orientation to the master's. Gandalf refuses. Gandalf sees through the rhetoric. Gandalf recognizes that the high and ultimate purpose is a fantasy, a story that Saruman tells himself to justify the unjustifiable, a narrative of pragmatic collaboration that conceals a reality of abject surrender. Gandalf says, "Saruman, I have heard speeches of this kind before, but only in the mouths of emissaries sent from Mordor to deceive the ignorant." The insult lands. Saruman's mask drops. The tempter becomes the tyrant. And Gandalf is imprisoned at the top of Orthanc, trapped on the roof of the tower by the being who was supposed to be his leader, held captive by the wizard who was supposed to be defending the free world. The imprisonment of Gandalf is one of the most shocking reversals in the story. Gandalf came to Orthanc for help. He came in good faith, riding to his leader, his colleague, the being he had served alongside for 2,000 years. He came with the expectation of counsel, of support, of the collaborative response to a crisis that the White Council was designed to provide, and he was locked in a cage. Trapped on the pinnacle of Orthanc, exposed to the wind and the weather, held there by the power of a being who had once been his friend and who was now his captor. The wizard who was supposed to be the greatest defender of the free world was now a prisoner of the wizard, who was supposed to be the second greatest defender. The imprisonment cost the free peoples months. While Gandalf was trapped on the roof of Orthanc, the ring was in the Shire, waiting. While Gandalf struggled to escape, Frodo was oblivious, living in Bag End, not knowing that the ring he had inherited from Bilbo was the most dangerous object in the world. The delay nearly proved fatal. If Gandalf had arrived in the Shire even a few weeks later, if the Nazgul had reached Bag End before Frodo left, the story would have ended differently. The quest would have failed. The ring would have returned to Sauron, and the cause of the failure would have been Saruman's betrayal. Gandalf escaped, of course. Gwaihir the Windlord, the Great Eagle, came to Orthanc and carried Gandalf away. The rescue was unexpected, unplanned, the kind of intervention that Saruman's analytical mind could not have predicted. Once again, the variables that saved the world were the variables that operated outside Saruman's framework. A friendship between a wizard and an eagle. A loyalty that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with love. Part 16. The Uruk-hai. While Gandalf was imprisoned on the pinnacle of Orthanc, Saruman was building an army. The Uruk-hai, Saruman's signature creation. Orcs, but different from the orcs of the mountains and the tunnels. Larger, stronger, able to endure sunlight. Able to march at speed over open ground. Able to function as disciplined soldiers rather than as the chaotic, bickering, poorly coordinated rabble that characterized most orc forces. Saruman bred them. The text does not tell us exactly how, and the vagueness is deliberate, because the process of creating the Uruk-hai is one of the darkest things in The Lord of the Rings. The implication is that Saruman crossbred orcs with men, that he performed a kind of forced biological engineering, combining the physical characteristics of orcs with the endurance and the intelligence of human beings, producing a hybrid warrior that was more effective than either parent species. The creation of the Uruk-hai is significant because it is a repetition of a very old sin. Morgoth created the orcs, corrupting and distorting elves into twisted, malicious creatures who served his will. Sauron continued the practice. And now Saruman, the being sent to oppose the tradition of Morgoth and Sauron, was doing the same thing, creating life through corruption, producing servants through the violation of natural processes, building an army by the same methods that the Dark Lords had used before him. The Uruk-hai also reveals something about Saruman's relationship with the mission he was given. The Astari were sent to Middle-earth to advise and to guide, to strengthen the Free People's own capacity for resistance, not to build independent armies. Saruman's Uruk-hai are the repudiation of this mandate. They are not an advisory service. They are a private military force, Saruman's own army, answering to Saruman's will, fighting Saruman's wars. The creation of the Uruk-hai is the moment when Saruman stops being an advisor and becomes a warlord, when he abandons the role the Valar gave him and assumes a role he designed for himself. The creation is also a perversion of the craft impulse in the most literal way possible. A Maya of all, a being whose nature is oriented toward making beautiful and useful things, is making weapons. Living weapons. Creatures bred for violence, shaped for destruction, designed to fight and to kill and to conquer. The craft that should have produced objects of beauty is producing objects of war. The maker's impulse is being channeled into the manufacture of soldiers. The irony is precise. Saruman, the Maya of Ol, was imitating not Ol, but Morgoth. The craft impulse that should have been directed toward creation was being directed toward corruption. The knowledge that should have been used to understand and to protect was being used to distort and to weaponize. Saruman was becoming the thing he was sent to fight, not merely allying with it, not merely cooperating with it, but actually reproducing its methods in his own domain. Isengard became a factory. The gardens that had once surrounded Orthanc were torn up. The trees were felled. The green spaces were replaced by pits and forges and furnaces, the industrial apparatus of Saruman's war machine, producing weapons and armor and the fuel that fed the fires of manufacture. The Ring of Isengard, which had been a place of beauty and of learning, became a wasteland of smoke and metal and the grinding noise of production. This too was a repetition. Morgoth had turned Angband into a factory. Sauron had turned Mordor into a factory. And now Saruman was turning Isengard into a factory, the same transformation, at a smaller scale, driven by the same impulse, producing the same result. The craft impulse, perverted by the desire for domination, turned the creative into the destructive. The smith became the slaveholder. The builder became the destroyer. Part 17. The Assault on Rohan. Saruman's war against Rohan is often overshadowed by the larger conflict, by the siege of Minas Tirith, by the march to the Black Gate, by the drama of the ring's destruction. But Saruman's assault on Rohan is important in its own right, because it reveals what Saruman had become and what kind of ruler he would have been if his plans had succeeded. Saruman attacked Rohan through both military force and political manipulation. The military assault, the raids, the burning of the Westfold, the march on Helm's Deep, was the visible expression of Saruman's war. But the political manipulation was equally important. The corruption of Thodin through Gurma Wormtongue, the systematic weakening of Rohan's leadership, the isolation of the king from his counselors and his people. Wormtongue was Saruman's agent, a man of Rohan who had been recruited by Saruman and placed in the king's household as a counselor and, eventually, as a controller. Wormtongue whispered in Thodun's ear. He poisoned the king's perception, turning Thodun against his own nephew Omer, undermining the king's confidence in his own judgment, creating a fog of confusion and despair that left Thodun passive and Rohan defenseless. The use of Wormtongue reveals Saruman's preferred method of domination. Saruman did not conquer through brute force alone. He conquered through influence, through the placement of agents, the manipulation of information, the corruption of leaders, the subtle, invisible, deniable control of the decision-making process. Saruman conquered from the inside. He found the cracks in the enemy's armor, the psychological vulnerabilities, the personal weaknesses, the points of leverage, and he exploited them with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a spider. Wormtongue's corruption of Thodun is, I think, one of the most psychologically devastating subplots in the entire Lord of the Rings. Thodun was a good king. He was brave, he was loyal, he loved his people. But Thodun was also old and grieving and vulnerable to the kind of slow, insidious, drip-by-drip erosion of confidence that a skilled manipulator like Wormtongue could administer. Wormtongue did not tell Thodun that Saruman was his master. He did not announce his treachery. He presented himself as a loyal advisor, a man who had the king's best interests at heart, who counseled caution and restraint, who warned against the rash actions that Thodun's other advisors proposed. Wormtongue's poison was administered in the language of care. His manipulation was dressed in the costume of concern. Every piece of harmful advice was presented as wisdom, and every act of sabotage was disguised as protection. The method is chillingly effective. And it is, I think, a reflection of Saruman's nature as a Maya of all, the craftsman's approach to domination. Saruman did not bludgeon. He engineered. He designed the outcome he wanted, and then built the mechanism to produce it. The mechanism was Wormtongue. The outcome was a broken king. The method was craft, the specific, precise, carefully calibrated application of influence to the points where it would produce the maximum effect. Part 18. Helm's Deep and the Failure. The Battle of Helm's Deep was Saruman's bid for military supremacy, the concentrated expression of everything he had built over the decades of his corruption. 10,000 Uruk-hai, armed with weapons forged in the pits of Isengard, marching through the rain toward the fortress where the remnants of Rohan's army had taken refuge. Saruman expected victory. The mathematics supported it. 10,000 against a few hundred. Uruk-hai against exhausted men, old soldiers and untrained boys pressed into service. The fortress was strong, but it was undermanned, undersupplied, and cut off from reinforcement. By every rational calculation, by every standard that Saruman's analytical mind could apply, the outcome was certain. And Saruman lost. He lost because of variables that his analysis could not accommodate. Gandalf, who should have been dead, arrived at Helm's Deep with reinforcements. Omer, who should have been exiled and powerless, rode to the rescue with the riders of Rohan. The Huorns, the half-awake trees of Fangorn Forest, beings that Saruman's analytical mind had not considered relevant, appeared in the night and destroyed the fleeing Uruk-hai. The defeat at Helm's Deep was Saruman's first experience of the principle that would ultimately destroy Sauron as well. The principle that the world does not operate according to the mathematics of power. The small matters, the unexpected matters, the unlikely, the irrational, the apparently insignificant. These are the factors that rational analysis cannot account for and that strategic calculation cannot predict. Saruman's analysis was correct within its own framework. But the framework was wrong. The framework excluded the variables that mattered most. Helm's Deep was a warning. It told Saruman, if Saruman had been willing to listen, that his worldview was flawed, that his analysis was incomplete, that the power-based calculation of outcomes was missing something essential. But Saruman did not listen. Saruman could not listen. His identity, his self-worth, his entire understanding of himself was built on the conviction that his analytical framework was correct. To admit that the framework was wrong was to admit that Saruman was wrong, and Saruman could not admit that Saruman was wrong. Part 19. The Ents. The destruction of Isengard by the Ents is one of the most cathartic moments in The Lord of the Rings, and it is also one of the most revealing moments in Saruman's story, because it shows us what happens when the natural world rises against the being who violated it. Treebeard and the Ents marched on Isengard because Saruman had been destroying the forest. The trees of Fangorn, ancient, slow-growing, irreplaceable, had been cut down by Saruman's orcs, felled for fuel, burned in the furnaces of Isengard's war machine. The destruction was systematic. Saruman did not merely clear land for practical purposes. He destroyed the forest with the thoroughness of a being who viewed the natural world as raw material, as a resource to be consumed, as an obstacle to be removed, as a thing without value except as fuel for his ambitions. The Ents responded. They marched, slowly, deliberately, with the accumulated fury of thousands of years of patient, watchful existence, and they tore Isengard apart. The walls were broken. The pits were flooded. The furnaces were drowned. The industrial apparatus that Saruman had spent decades building was destroyed in hours by beings that Saruman had not considered a threat. The destruction is cathartic because it is righteous. The Ents are the guardians of the forest, beings who have spent millennia watching over the trees, caring for them, speaking with them in the slow, patient language of growing things. And they have watched Saruman destroy their charges. They have watched the axes bite into the trunks of ancient trees. They have watched the smoke rise from the furnaces that burn the wood that the Ents loved. They have watched, with the slow-building rage of beings who do not anger easily, but who, when angered, are terrible beyond reckoning. Treebeard's judgment on Saruman is one of the great lines in the book, A Wizard Should Know Better. The line carries the weight of millennia. Treebeard has seen wizards before. Treebeard has seen Gandalf, the wizard who loved trees, who walked in the forest, who treated the growing things with respect. Treebeard knows what a wizard should be. And Saruman is not it. Saruman has taken the wizard's knowledge, the understanding of the world's workings, the mastery of the principles that govern nature, and has turned it against nature. The wizard who should have been the forest's greatest protector has become its greatest destroyer. The destruction of Isengard is a judgment. It is the natural world's verdict on Saruman's corruption. The response of living things to a being who treated living things as objects. Saruman, the Maya of all, the craftsman, the builder, had forgotten the difference between raw material and living beings. He had treated the trees the way he treated everything else, as resources to be consumed in the service of his ambitions. And the resources fought back. The Ents are, I think, Tolkien's answer to the specific kind of evil that Saruman represents, the evil of industrialization, of the reduction of the living to the mechanical, of the treatment of the natural world as a warehouse of raw materials waiting to be processed. Saruman's Isengard is a factory. The Ents' response is the revolt of the factory's raw materials, the rebellion of the things that were consumed, the uprising of the beings that were used. Part 20. The voice of Saruman. After the destruction of Isengard, There is a chapter in The Two Towers that is, I think, one of the most brilliantly written chapters in the entire Lord of the Rings. It is called The Voice of Saruman, and it reveals more clearly than any other scene the specific nature of Saruman's power and the specific mechanism of his corruption. Saruman is trapped in Orthanc. The tower is intact, the Ents could not break it, but the fortress around it is destroyed. Saruman is, for all practical purposes, a prisoner. He has no army. He has no resources. He has no allies. He has nothing except his voice, and his voice is terrifying. Gandalf and Thodin and the others stand below the tower, and Saruman speaks to them from above. And his voice, the voice of Saruman, capitalized by Tolkien to indicate its supernatural quality, is the most seductive thing they have ever heard. The voice is warm. The voice is reasonable. The voice is the sound of a wise old friend offering good counsel. The sound of a being who has thought deeply about the situation and who has arrived at conclusions that the listener will find difficult to resist. The voice almost works. Thodin almost listens. The riders of Rohan almost waver. The sound of Saruman's speech, the beauty of it, the reasonableness of it, the carefully calibrated emotional appeal of it, nearly undoes the victory that the battle won. Gimli provides the counterweight. He recognizes the voice as a weapon and calls it out. Thodin, drawing on his hard-won wisdom and the memory of what Saruman's influence cost Rohan, resists, and Gandalf speaks with the authority of the being who has been sent back from death, who has been elevated from grey to white, who now holds the authority that Saruman forfeited. The Voice of Saruman chapter is important because it shows us the mechanism of Saruman's corruption in action, the specific tool that Saruman used to control and to manipulate, the weapon that was his most characteristic and his most dangerous gift. Saruman's armies could be defeated. His fortress could be destroyed. His staff could be broken. But his voice was the last thing to go, the last weapon in his arsenal, the last expression of the power that had once made him the most influential being in the Astari Order. The voice is persuasion weaponized. It is the sound of a being who understands, with clinical precision, how the listener's mind works, what the listener fears, what the listener hopes for, what arguments will resonate, and what emotional frequencies will create sympathy. Saruman's voice does not lie exactly. It tells a version of the truth, a selected, curated, carefully framed version that leads the listener toward the conclusion that Saruman wants the listener to reach. The voice is propaganda in its purest form, not the denial of reality, but the reshaping of reality, the presentation of facts in an order and a context that produces a predetermined emotional response. The voice also reveals the ultimate bankruptcy of Saruman's character. When everything else is gone, when the army is destroyed, and the fortress is ruined, and the rank is stripped, and the staff is about to be broken, Saruman still has his voice. And the voice is still dangerous. But the voice is also empty. It is a sound without substance. It is the echo of a being who has been hollowed out by corruption, who has nothing left except the ability to make other people feel things that serve his purposes. Gandalf breaks Saruman's staff. The breaking is symbolic and real, the removal of Saruman's wizardly authority, the formal expulsion from the Order, the declaration that Saruman is no longer an Istar, no longer a servant of the Valar, no longer a participant in the sacred mission for which he was sent to Middle-earth. Saruman's response to the breaking of his staff is revealing. He does not rage. He does not weep. He does not beg. He retreats into the tower, retreats into himself, retreats into the last refuge of a defeated pride, contempt. Saruman cannot accept what has happened to him. He cannot process the defeat, the humiliation, the loss of everything he has built. So he retreats into the one thing he still has, the conviction that he is right and that everyone else is wrong. Part 21. Gandalf the White. The elevation of Gandalf, from grey to white, from second to first, from subordinate to superior, is the final, complete, irrevocable expression of the judgment that had been building for 2,000 years. Gandalf died in Moria. He fell with the Balrog, fought the creature for 10 days on the peak of Xaraxagil, killed the Balrog and died. And Gandalf was sent back. Sent back by the Valar, or by Ilúvatar himself, the text is not entirely clear. Sent back to complete the mission that Saruman had abandoned. And Gandalf was sent back as Gandalf the White. The colour that Saruman had worn. The rank that Saruman had held. The authority that Saruman had forfeited. Gandalf returned from death wearing the title and the colour that Saruman had cast aside, when he chose the many colours over the white. When he chose complexity over clarity. When he chose his own ambitions over the mission he was given. The elevation is not a reward. It is a correction. The Valar are not promoting Gandalf for good behaviour. They are fixing a mistake. The mistake of placing Saruman at the head of the Order. The mistake of entrusting the leadership to the being with the most knowledge rather than the being with the most wisdom. The elevation of Gandalf is the recognition that wisdom matters more than knowledge, that humility matters more than capability, that the being who confessed fear was always the better choice for the mission than the being who did not. For Saruman, the elevation is the final humiliation, the visible, public, undeniable confirmation of everything that Círdan's gift and Galadriel's preference had implied. Gandalf is the one who matters. Gandalf has always been the one who matters. Saruman's leadership was a mistake, and the mistake has been corrected. And the correction is wearing white robes and carrying a white staff, and speaking with an authority that Saruman's voice, for all its seductive power, cannot match. The humiliation does not produce repentance. In a different character, in a being with more humility, more self-awareness, more capacity for honest self-examination, the humiliation might have been the beginning of redemption. The recognition that he had failed, that his way was wrong, that his pride had led him to ruin. This recognition could have been the turning point. Saruman could have repented. The option was available. The door was open. But Saruman chose not to walk through it. Saruman chose pride over repentance. Saruman chose the conviction of his own rightness over the evidence of his wrongness. And the choice sealed his fate, not because repentance was no longer possible, but because Saruman would never again be in a position to receive the help that repentance required. There is a detail in this part of the story that most readers pass over, but that I find deeply poignant. Gandalf does not enjoy his elevation. Gandalf does not celebrate the fact that he has replaced Saruman. He does not gloat. He does not present his new authority as a vindication of his character or a rebuke of Saruman's. When Gandalf tells the others that he is now Saruman, I am Saruman, or rather Saruman as he should have been, the words carry no triumph. They carry grief. The grief of a being who has watched a colleague fall. The grief of a being who understands, perhaps better than anyone, how close the fall was to being preventable. How many moments there were when a different choice could have changed the outcome. How many opportunities for humility were missed. How many doors were open that Saruman chose not to walk through. Gandalf grieves for Saruman because Gandalf understands Saruman. They are both Maiar. They are both wizards. They both carry the same divine mandate, the same sense of purpose, the same weight of responsibility. And Gandalf knows with the certainty of personal experience, how difficult the mission is, how strong the temptations are, how easy it would be to drift, to rationalize, to convince yourself that your personal ambitions are the same as your divine purpose. Gandalf resisted these temptations. Saruman did not. And the difference was not intelligence or knowledge or capability, but the simple, unsexy, unimpressive quality of admitting that you might be wrong. Part 22. The Palantir Throne. When Wormtongue throws the Palantir from the Tower of Orthanc, he creates, by accident or by design, one of the most pivotal moments in the War of the Ring. And the moment is pivotal not because of what the Palantir does in the hands of the heroes, but because of what it reveals about Saruman's situation. Wormtongue throws the stone at Gandalf in a fit of rage. He misses. Pippin picks it up. Gandalf takes it. And now the Palantir of Orthanc is in the hands of the good guys, and Saruman is cut off. Cut off from Sauron. Cut off from the network of seeing stones that connected him to the wider war. Cut off from the source of information, and, more importantly, cut off from the source of influence that had been shaping his decisions for years. The Palantir was Saruman's connection to Sauron, and the loss of the Palantir was the severing of that connection. The severance should have been liberating. With the Palantir gone, Sauron's influence was removed. Saruman was free to think clearly, free to reassess, free to recognize, without the constant pressure of Sauron's manipulative visions, that the path he had been following was wrong. But freedom requires the capacity to use it, and Saruman, after decades of Sauron's influence, after centuries of his own pride, after a lifetime of choices that had systematically eroded his moral compass and his capacity for honest self-reflection, Saruman did not have the capacity to use the freedom. The chains were gone, but the prisoner had become so accustomed to the chains that he could not walk without them. Saruman without the Palantir was not a liberated being. He was a diminished being. He had lost his army. He had lost his fortress. He had lost his staff and his rank and his authority. He had lost his connection to Sauron. And he had lost, long ago, the internal resources, the humility, the self-awareness, the capacity for repentance that would have allowed him to rebuild from the ruins. Part 23. The Offered Hand. Gandalf offers Saruman redemption. Twice, the first time is at Orthanc, before the staff breaking, when Gandalf looks up at the ruined wizard in his ruined tower and offers him a choice. Come down. Leave the tower. Abandon the ambition and the pride. Join the effort against Sauron, not as a leader, not as the head of the Order, but as a participant, a contributor, a being who has made terrible mistakes and who is willing to help repair the damage. The offer is genuine. Gandalf is not being diplomatic. He is not performing generosity for the benefit of an audience. He is offering Saruman a real chance at redemption, a chance to step back from the abyss, to begin the long, painful, humbling process of undoing what his pride has done. The chance is real. The offer is sincere. The door is open. Saruman refuses. He refuses with contempt, the contempt of a being who cannot accept help, who cannot admit failure, who cannot submit to the authority of a being he has spent centuries regarding as his inferior. Saruman would rather be trapped in a ruined tower, stripped of his power and his status, than accept redemption from Gandalf. The refusal tells us everything. It tells us that Saruman's pride has become absolute, so total, so consuming, so completely integrated into his identity that he would rather be destroyed than humble himself. The offer of redemption requires humility. It requires the admission that Saruman was wrong, that his entire approach, his entire worldview, his entire career was based on a fundamental error, and Saruman cannot make that admission. The admission would destroy the one thing he has left, his self-image as a being of superior wisdom and judgment. The second offer comes at the Shire, near the end of the story, when Frodo offers Saruman mercy. But we will come to that. Part 24. The Descent. After Orthanc, Saruman descends, and the descent is one of the most psychologically precise portrayals of degradation in all of literature, a step-by-step, stage-by-stage illustration of what happens to a proud being who has lost everything except the pride. Saruman leaves Orthanc. The Ents, following Treebeard's decision to release him, let him go. Saruman walks away from the tower that was his seat of power for 2.5 centuries. He walks away with nothing, no army, no fortress, no staff, no rank, no resources, no allies. He has Wormtongue. That is all. The wizard and his servant walking away from the ruins of everything they built. The descent is physical, from the height of Orthanc to the roads of Middle-earth, from the seat of power to the dusty tracks of the countryside. But it is also moral and psychological. With each step away from Orthanc, Saruman becomes less powerful, less significant, less connected to the cosmic drama that is unfolding around him. The War of the Ring continues. The great events proceed. And Saruman is no longer a participant. He is a spectator, a former player, watching from the sidelines as the game he tried to dominate moves on without him. The loss of significance is, I think, more devastating to Saruman than the loss of power. Saruman has always defined himself by his importance, by his role in the great events, by his position at the center of the cosmic drama, by his significance to the fate of the world. And now the world does not need him. The world has moved on, the drama continues, and Saruman is not in it, and the world does not notice his absence. For a being whose entire identity is built on the conviction that he is essential, that his knowledge, his wisdom, his strategic vision are indispensable to the outcome of the great events, the discovery that he is dispensable is the ultimate humiliation. Saruman is not needed. Saruman has never been needed. The mission that Saruman led was completed by the wizard he regarded as his inferior. The war that Saruman tried to shape was won by forces that operated outside Saruman's understanding. The world was saved without Saruman's help. Part 25. The Road to the Shire. Saruman goes to the Shire. Of all the places in Middle-earth, the great cities, the ancient forests, the storied kingdoms, Saruman goes to the Shire. And the choice reveals with devastating clarity the final state of his corruption. Why the Shire? Because Saruman cannot hurt Sauron. He cannot hurt Gandalf. He cannot hurt the great and the powerful, the kings and the lords, the beings who defeated him and who stripped him of his authority. But he can hurt hobbits. He can hurt the small and the defenseless, the beings who cannot fight back, the creatures who represent everything that Saruman despises and everything that Saruman secretly envies. The Shire is Gandalf's place. The Shire is the place that Gandalf loves, the place where Gandalf found his deepest connections, his truest friendships, his most authentic joy. By destroying the Shire, Saruman can hurt Gandalf. By ruining the thing that Gandalf loves, Saruman can inflict the one kind of damage that is still within his diminished power, the damage of spite, the destruction of beauty, the ruination of the innocent, the petty, vindictive, impotent cruelty of a fallen being who has lost the capacity for grand evil and who must content himself with the small and the mean. The decision to go to the Shire is the final proof of Saruman's fall. The being who was sent to oppose the greatest evil in Middle-earth has been reduced to bullying farmers. The Maya of Ul, the head of the Astari, the Councillor of Kings, This being is now terrorizing gardeners and stealing crops and cutting down trees in a country that poses no threat to anyone. The degradation is measured by the shrinking of Saruman's ambitions. In his prime, Saruman's ambition was cosmic. He wanted the ring. He wanted to rival Sauron. He wanted to reshape the world according to his design. At Isengard, his ambition was regional. He wanted to conquer Rohan, to build a kingdom, to establish himself as a power in the west of Middle-earth. In the Shire, his ambition is parochial. He wants to ruin a garden. He wants to cut down a tree. He wants to make hobbits miserable. The shrinking is the trajectory of pride without substance. Pride, when it is backed by genuine power, can accomplish terrible things. Pride, when the power is stripped away, can only accomplish petty things. And the pettiness is more revealing than the terror, because the pettiness shows us the truth about the person underneath the power. Saruman with an army was a threat. Saruman without an army is a bully. The difference tells us what the army was hiding: a small, spiteful, insecure being who needed the apparatus of power to feel significant. The degradation is complete. Saruman has travelled the full arc, from the highest position available to a mortal embodied being in Middle-earth to the lowest expression of petty tyranny imaginable. From the head of the Astari to the bully of the Shire, from the counsellor of the wise to the oppressor of halflings, from Saruman the White to Sharky, a name that the orcs gave him, a name that means old man, a name that reduces the once great wizard to a figure of contempt even among the creatures he commanded. Part 26. Sharky. The name Sharky deserves attention, because names matter in Tolkien's world, and the progression of Saruman's names tells the story of his fall as clearly as any narrative. Curumo. The original name. The Maya name. The name that connected the spirit to the blessed realm, to the service of all, to the divine mission for which he was created. This name was left behind when the Maya took mortal form and came to Middle-earth. Saruman, Curunr, the wizard name. The name of authority and respect. The name that kings used when they sought counsel, that elves used when they discussed the strategy of the wise, that the peoples of Middle-earth associated with learning and wisdom and the defense of the free world. Saruman the White. The title. The formal designation of rank and role, the identification of Saruman as the head of the Astari, the chief of the wizards, the being who wore the colour of purity and purpose. Saruman of many colours, the self-given title. The first sign of corruption, the replacement of the clear, singular, purpose-driven white with the fractured, ambiguous, self-celebrating multiplicity that represented Saruman's departure from his mission. And then Sharky. The orc name. The insult name. The name that the lowest creatures in Middle-earth gave to the being who had once been the highest. A name that means nothing more than old man, that carries no dignity, no authority, no connection to the divine origin or the sacred mission or the cosmic significance that wants to find him. The progression is the full. Curumo to Sharky. Angel to bully. The servant of all to the tyrant of hobbits. Each name marks a stage in the descent, a further distance from the origin, a further degradation of the being, a further loss of the identity that the name was supposed to represent. Part 27. The Scouring of the Shire. The Scouring of the Shire is the chapter that Peter Jackson cut from his film adaptation, the chapter that many viewers do not know exists, the chapter that is, I would argue, the most important chapter in the entire Lord of the Rings. The hobbits return from the War of the Ring. They have crossed Middle-earth. They have faced Ringwraiths and Balrogs and the armies of Mordor. They have carried the ring to Mount Doom and destroyed it. They have participated in the greatest events of the age, events of cosmic significance, events that determined the fate of the world. And they come home. And home is ruined. Saruman has taken over the Shire. His agents, a combination of ruffians, half-orcs and corrupted hobbits, have imposed a regime of petty tyranny on the peaceful land. Trees have been cut down, homes have been demolished, the old mill has been replaced by a factory. Rules and regulations have been imposed, restrictions on food, on drink, on the gathering in public, on the simple pleasures that made the Shire the Shire. The Scouring is Saruman's final work. It is the last expression of his creative impulse, the craft impulse that was once oriented toward beauty and order, and that is now oriented toward destruction and control. Saruman cannot build. He can only ruin. He cannot create. He can only distort. The being who was sent to protect the world is now destroying the smallest, most beautiful, most innocent part of it, not because the destruction serves any strategic purpose, but because destruction is the only expression of will that remains to him. The hobbits fight back. Merry and Pippin, veterans of the war, organize the resistance. The Battle of Bywater is fought, the last battle of the War of the Ring, fought not on the fields of Pelennor or at the Black Gate, but in the lanes and meadows of the Shire, by hobbits defending their homes against the agents of a fallen wizard. The hobbits win. Of course the hobbits win. The beings that Sauron could not account for, the beings that Saruman dismissed as insignificant, the small and the ordinary and the overlooked, they win. They always win, in Tolkien's world. The small and the overlooked always win, not because they are powerful, but because they are brave, and because they fight for things that are worth fighting for: home, community, the green things growing, the simple pleasures that make life meaningful. The Battle of Bywater is in many ways the most satisfying battle in the entire Lord of the Rings, more satisfying than Helm's Deep, more satisfying than Pelennor Fields, more satisfying than the last stand at the Black Gate. Because the Battle of Bywater is fought by hobbits for the Shire. It is not a battle for the fate of the world. It is a battle for home, for the road you walk down every morning, for the tree you climbed as a child, for the tavern where your friends meet on market day. The hobbits who fight at Bywater are not soldiers. They are not warriors. They are not heroes in the conventional sense. They are farmers and gardeners and brewers and millers. Ordinary hobbits who have been pushed past the point of tolerance by a petty tyrant and who have decided, collectively, that enough is enough. Their courage is not the courage of the battlefield. It is the courage of the threshold. The courage that says, "You will not cross this line. You will not come into my home. You will not destroy what I love." And the courage is enough. It is enough to defeat Saruman's ruffians. It is enough to liberate the Shire. It is enough to prove one final time that the small and the ordinary and the overlooked are capable of extraordinary things when the things they love are threatened. Part 28. Frodo's Mercy. When the hobbits confront Saruman in the Shire, Frodo offers him mercy. This is the second offer of redemption, the second time that the door is opened, the second chance that is extended to a being who has done nothing to deserve it. Frodo tells the hobbits not to kill Saruman. Frodo recognizes, with the specific, hard-won wisdom of a ring-bearer who has experienced the seductive power of evil, that Saruman is still capable of change. That somewhere inside the ruined wizard, underneath the layers of pride and spite and accumulated corruption, there may still be a spark of the being who was sent to Middle-earth for a sacred purpose. The mercy is remarkable because of who is offering it. Frodo has suffered more from the war than almost anyone. Frodo has carried the ring to Mount Doom, Frodo has been broken by the ring's influence. Frodo has lost friends, lost his health, lost his connection to normal life. And Frodo, who has every reason to be bitter and vengeful, offers mercy to the being who ruined his home. Saruman's response is contemptuous. He sneers at Frodo. He mocks the mercy. He says, with the bitterness of a being who cannot accept what has been offered, that he has lost everything, and that Frodo's mercy is an insult, not because it is undeserved, but because it comes from a hobbit, from one of the small people, from one of the beings that Saruman has spent his entire career regarding as beneath his notice. Saruman cannot accept mercy, because accepting mercy requires humility. It requires the admission that you need help, that you are not self-sufficient, that your own resources are not enough to save you. Saruman has never admitted any of these things. His entire identity is built on the conviction that he is capable, self-sufficient, and independent of the help of others. To accept mercy from Frodo would be to admit that a hobbit, a halfling, a creature of the Shire, a being of no strategic significance, has something that Saruman needs, and Saruman would rather die than make that admission. Part 29. The Knife. Saruman tries to stab Frodo. This detail is often overlooked, but it is important, because it shows us the final state of Saruman's character, a being so consumed by spite that he attempts murder with his own hands. The Maya who was sent to Council Kings is now trying to stab a hobbit. The wizard who commanded armies is reaching for a knife. The scholar of ring lore, the head of the Astari, the being who sat at the councils of the wise, this being is making a physical attack on a being 1/3 his size, driven not by strategy or by ambition, but by the simple, animal, impotent rage of a creature that has lost everything and that cannot bear the humiliation of mercy. The mithril coat saves Frodo, the knife does not penetrate. And the failed murder is the final expression of Saruman's impotence, the proof that the once great wizard cannot even accomplish a simple act of violence against an unarmed hobbit. Saruman has been stripped of everything: his power, his authority, his rank, his army, his fortress, his sorcery. And now he has been stripped of the ability to harm, reduced to a being whose spite exceeds his capacity, whose hatred is larger than his reach, whose desire to destroy is matched only by his inability to do so. Part 30. The Death. Saruman's death is the work of Wormtongue. Grumar Wormtongue, the man of Rohan who served as Saruman's agent, who corrupted Thodin, who spent years operating as Saruman's instrument in the court of Edoras, Wormtongue kills Saruman. He cuts the wizard's throat with a knife, slitting it from behind. The coward's method, the servant's revenge. The killing is triggered by Saruman's cruelty. Saruman has been mistreating Wormtongue for months, beating him, insulting him, treating him with a casual, habitual, unthinking cruelty that has become Saruman's default mode of interaction with everyone around him. Wormtongue has endured the abuse because Wormtongue has nowhere else to go. He is an outcast, a traitor to his own people, a man whose crimes have placed him beyond the reach of normal society. Wormtongue stays with Saruman because Wormtongue has no other option. But everyone has a limit, and Wormtongue reaches his. When Saruman kicks him, physically kicks him, in front of the assembled hobbits, treating him like a dog, Wormtongue snaps. The years of accumulated abuse, the decades of servitude, the systematic degradation that Saruman has inflicted on his most loyal servant, all of it boils over in a single, violent, irreversible act. The death is fitting. Saruman is killed by his own creation, by the instrument of his own corruption, by the being who carried out his orders and who suffered for his service. The master is destroyed by the servant. The dominator is overcome by the dominated. The being who used people is used one final time by the person he used most. The death also illustrates the final law of Saruman's corruption. Cruelty consumes itself. The being who was more cruel than any orc, for Tolkien uses this same phrase to describe the Mouth of Sauron. And Saruman, in his final days, operates at the same level of needless, purposeless, gratuitous cruelty, is killed by cruelty's blowback. The rage that cruelty generates in its victims, the violence that cruelty stores in the hearts of the beings it abuses, eventually turns against the source. Saruman's cruelty created the conditions for his own destruction. The Dominator made the weapon that killed the Dominator. There is something almost unbearable about the image of Saruman being killed by Wormtongue, the greatest of the Astari, the Maya sent by the Valar, the head of the Wizard Order, the being who was chosen to lead the most important mission of the Third Age, killed by a coward with a knife, in the road outside a hobbit hole, witnessed by halflings. The death is undignified. It is ignoble. It is stripped of every shred of the grandeur and the significance that Saruman spent his entire career constructing. And the stripping is the point. Saruman's entire career was an exercise in the construction of significance, the building of a self-image, the accumulation of status, the cultivation of the impression that Saruman was important, that Saruman mattered, that Saruman was a being of cosmic consequence. The death strips all of this away. The death says, you were not important. You were not a figure of cosmic consequence. You were a bully who got killed by his own servant, and your death will be remembered not as a tragedy, but as a cautionary tale. Part 31. The Spirit Rejected. When Saruman dies, something happens that is easy to miss, but that is one of the most devastating details in the entire Lord of the Rings. Saruman's spirit rises from his body. The mortal form that the Maya wore in Middle-earth lies on the ground, ruined, diminished, already beginning to decay. And the spirit, the Maya spirit, the divine essence that animated the mortal body, rises upward. The spirit looks west, toward the blessed realm, toward Valinor, toward the home from which it came, the place where it was created, the source of its being and its purpose. The spirit looks west because the west is where the dead Istari would return, where the mission would end, where the divine spirits would go home. And a wind blows from the west. A cold wind, a wind that comes from the direction of the blessed realm and that says without words, in the language of divine rejection, no, you cannot come home. The west is closed to you. The mission that you were given has been betrayed, and the home to which you would return has rejected you, and the spirit that was Kurumo is no longer welcome in the place from which Kurumo came. The spirit dissolves. It dissipates. It blows away, formless, homeless, rejected, like smoke in the wind. The Maya who was chosen by all, who was sent by the Valar, who was given the greatest responsibility in the Third Age, dies in the road outside Bag End and is denied even the return to the place of his origin. The rejection is cosmic. It is not merely the death of a wizard. It is the judgment of the divine on a being who was given everything: knowledge, power, rank, purpose, the support of the greatest beings in the world, and who squandered it all. The wind from the west is the Valar's final word on Saruman. The mission is over, the servant has failed, and the failure is absolute. Part 32. The body. After the spirit's departure, Saruman's body undergoes a transformation that is one of the most unsettling images in the story. The body shrivels. It decays. It ages rapidly, visibly, in front of the watching hobbits, as though centuries of suppressed mortality are catching up all at once. The face collapses. The skin pulls tight against the bones. The body becomes something ancient, something desiccated, something that looks as though it has been dead for a very long time and has only now been allowed to show it. The decay is the visible expression of what the corruption did to Saruman's mortal form. The body was sustained by the Maya spirit, by the divine essence that animated the flesh and that kept the aging and the degradation at bay. When the spirit departed, the body was left with nothing, no sustaining force, no animating power, no connection to the divine that had kept it whole. And the body, deprived of its spiritual core, revealed what it had become: a husk, a shell, a container that had been emptied of everything that gave it substance, and that was now, belatedly, showing the emptiness. The body's decay mirrors the spirit's corruption. Just as Saruman's spirit had been gradually hollowed out by pride and ambition and the long, slow erosion of purpose, so the body, once the spirit was gone, revealed the hollowness. The outside had been maintained while the inside was consumed. The appearance had been preserved while the substance was destroyed. The body, like the spirit, was a lie, a surface that concealed an absence. Part 33. The parallel with Sauron. Saruman's fall mirrors Sauron's fall, not identically but structurally, with the same essential pattern reproduced at a smaller scale. Sauron was a Maya of all. Saruman was a Maya of all. Both were shaped by the same impulses, the desire to craft, to order, to master the principles of the world. Both were drawn to power by the logic of their natures. Both were corrupted by the belief that their understanding entitled them to dominion. Sauron served Morgoth. Saruman served Sauron. The same hierarchical relationship, the capable subordinate serving the greater dark power, reproduced at a different scale. Sauron was Morgoth's lieutenant. Saruman was Sauron's lieutenant. The pattern recurs because the impulse recurs. The impulse to serve power rather than to serve good. To attach oneself to the winning side rather than to the right side. Sauron made the one ring. Saruman tried to make a ring. The ring-making is the supreme expression of the craft impulse turned to domination, the creation of a device that imposes the maker's will on the world. Sauron achieved it. Saruman aspired to it. The aspiration is the proof that Saruman understood, at some level, what he was becoming, that he recognized the trajectory of his corruption, and that he embraced it rather than resisting it. Sauron fell in the Elder Days and was overthrown twice, once at the end of the Second Age by the Last Alliance, and once at the end of the Third Age by the destruction of the Ring. Saruman fell in the Third Age and was overthrown 3 times, once by Gandalf at Orthanc, once by the Ents at Isengard, and once by the hobbits at Bywater. Each overthrow was smaller than the last. Each defeat was less significant than the previous one. The trajectory of Saruman's defeats mirrors the trajectory of his corruption. Downward. Always downward. From the cosmic to the parochial, from the world historical to the village level. Sauron's fall was cosmic, the corruption of an angelic spirit by the first Dark Lord. The turning of a being of extraordinary capability from creation to destruction, the transformation of a smith into a tyrant. Saruman's fall is the same story at a smaller scale. The same corruption, the same turning, the same transformation. Happening not in the cosmic drama of the First Age, but in the more intimate, more human-scaled drama of the Third. The parallel tells us that the pattern is not unique to Sauron. The fall is not a one-time event, a singular catastrophe that happened once and will never happen again. The fall is a template. It is a recurring pattern in the moral structure of the world. A pattern that can reproduce itself whenever the conditions are right, whenever a being of knowledge and capability encounters the temptation of power and lacks the humility to resist. Part 34. The Pride. Pride is the through line. Pride is the consistent, continuous, never-absent element in Saruman's fall, the quality that was present at every stage, that enabled every bad decision, that prevented every opportunity for redemption. The pride was there at the beginning, in Kuramo's confidence when he accepted the mission, in his certainty that his abilities were equal to the task, in his assumption that his selection as leader was a recognition of his inherent superiority. The pride was there in the middle, in Saruman's resentment of Gandalf, in his refusal to accept counsel, in his conviction that his analysis of the strategic situation was correct and that everyone who disagreed was wrong. The pride was there at the end, in Saruman's refusal to accept mercy, in his contempt for the hobbits who defeated him, in his preference for degradation and death over the humiliation of admitting that he was wrong. The pride was the constant. The pride was the thing that did not change, the fixed point around which everything else rotated, the immovable center of gravity that pulled every other quality in Saruman's character toward it. Knowledge, once oriented towards service, was pulled towards self-aggrandizement. Craft, once oriented toward creation, was pulled toward domination. Analysis, once oriented toward understanding, was pulled toward manipulation. Every quality, every talent, every gift that Saruman possessed was captured by the gravitational pull of the pride and redirected toward the service of the self. Gandalf's humility was the opposite gravitational force. Gandalf's fear, Gandalf's self-doubt, Gandalf's willingness to admit that he was not enough. These qualities created a different center of gravity, one that pulled Gandalf's talents and gifts toward the service of others rather than the service of himself. The two wizards are defined by their centers of gravity. Saruman's center is himself. Gandalf's center is others. And the difference, the simple, fundamental, seemingly small difference between self-orientation and other-orientation, is the difference between the wizard who saved the world and the wizard who tried to enslave it. Part 35. The Knowledge Trap. Saruman's story is, at its heart, a warning about the danger of knowledge without wisdom. Knowledge is good. Tolkien does not condemn knowledge. He does not suggest that the pursuit of understanding is inherently dangerous, or that the accumulation of expertise is a path to evil. The elves are beings of extraordinary knowledge. Fanor's craft, Elrond's lore, Galadriel's understanding of the forces that shape the world. And their knowledge is, for the most part, a force for good. But knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. And the distinction between knowledge and wisdom is the distinction between Saruman and Gandalf, the distinction that defines the two wizards and that determines their fates. Knowledge is the understanding of how things work. Wisdom is the understanding of what things mean. Knowledge can tell you how to build a ring of power. Wisdom can tell you whether you should. Knowledge can analyze the strategic situation and calculate the probability of victory. Wisdom can tell you that the probability of victory is not the only consideration, that there are things worth fighting for even when the odds are against you, that there are principles worth maintaining even when maintaining them is irrational. Saruman had knowledge, vast, deep, comprehensive knowledge of the rings, of the enemy, of the forces at play in Middle-earth, of the strategic situation and its implications. Saruman's knowledge was, in many ways, greater than Gandalf's. Saruman knew more. He had studied more. He had accumulated more information and had processed that information with greater rigour and greater sophistication. But Saruman lacked wisdom. He lacked the capacity to see beyond the information, to perceive the meaning behind the data, to understand the moral implications of the strategic analysis, to recognize that the numbers and the calculations and the rational assessments were not the whole picture. Saruman could not see the hobbits. He could not see the value of the small. He could not perceive the power of hope, or the significance of mercy, or the world-changing potential of a being who admits fear and accepts help. The knowledge trap is this: the more you know, the more confident you become in your own understanding. And the more confident you become, the less room you leave for the things you do not know, for the surprises, the exceptions, the unexpected interventions of grace and courage and love that operate outside the framework of rational analysis. Saruman fell into the knowledge trap. He knew so much that he could not imagine there was anything he did not know. And the things he did not know were the things that mattered most. Part 36. The Loss of Purpose. The Astari were sent to Middle-earth with a purpose, to help the Free Peoples resist Sauron. The purpose was the anchor, the fixed reference point that was supposed to keep the wizards oriented, that was supposed to prevent the drift that comes from centuries of immersion in the complexities and the temptations of the mortal world. Saruman lost his purpose, not all at once, not in a dramatic moment of renunciation, but gradually, incrementally, through the slow, almost imperceptible process of substituting his own goals for the goals he was given. The substitution happened in stages. At first, Saruman's personal goals were aligned with his mission. Studying the rings was part of the mission. Building alliances was part of the mission. Acquiring knowledge of the enemy was part of the mission. Saruman could pursue his own interests and fulfill his purpose simultaneously, because his interests and his purpose pointed in the same direction. But over time, the interests diverged from the purpose. The study of the rings became an end in itself, rather than a means to an end. The alliances became instruments of personal power, rather than tools of collective defense. The knowledge became a source of personal pride, rather than a resource for the common good. Saruman's personal goals, gradually and almost invisibly, replaced his divine purpose as the orienting principle of his life. The replacement was so gradual that Saruman may not have noticed it. He may have believed, until very late in the process, that he was still fulfilling his mission, that the pursuit of the ring, the accumulation of power, the construction of his own domain were all in service of the larger goal of opposing Sauron. The self-deception was complete. The man who was pursuing his own ambitions convinced himself that his ambitions were the mission. This is, I think, the most realistic aspect of Saruman's fall. Most people who lose their way do not do so through a dramatic act of betrayal. They do so through drift, through the slow, incremental, day-by-day substitution of what they want for what they were supposed to do. The drift is invisible from the inside. The drifter does not feel the movement. The drifter believes, with perfect sincerity, that he is still on course, because the destination has changed, imperceptibly and continuously, to match his current position. Part 37. The Warning for the Wise. Saruman's fall is Tolkien's warning, not to the weak, not to the foolish, not to the vulnerable, but to the strong, to the capable, to the intelligent, to the wise. The warning is this: your gifts are your greatest danger. The very qualities that make you capable, the intelligence, the knowledge, the strategic vision, the capacity for analysis, are the qualities that will betray you if they are not accompanied by humility. The smarter you are, the more convincing your rationalizations will be. The more you know, the more confident you will be in your conclusions. The more capable you are, the more you will trust yourself, and the more you trust yourself, the less room you will leave for the possibility that you are wrong. Saruman was not a weak being who was overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. He was a strong being who was undone by his own strength. His intelligence created the rationalizations that justified his betrayal. His knowledge fueled the confidence that blinded him to his errors. His capability sustained the ambition that replaced his purpose. Every gift that made Saruman great was a gift that contributed to his fall. The warning is aimed at the reader, at the viewer, at anyone who has been told, by teachers, by mentors, by the culture at large, that intelligence and capability are sufficient protections against moral failure. They are not. Intelligence can rationalize anything. Capability can achieve anything, including its own destruction. Knowledge can understand everything, except the things that matter most. The protection against Saruman's fall is not more intelligence, more knowledge, more capability. The protection is humility, the simple, unsexy, unimpressive quality of admitting that you might be wrong, that your analysis might be incomplete, that the being next to you, the one who is afraid, the one who admits weakness, the one who smokes pipeweed with hobbits, might see something that you cannot. Part 38. The Wormtongue Parallel. Saruman's relationship with Wormtongue is a mirror of Sauron's relationship with Saruman, and the mirror reveals the recursive nature of corruption, the way domination reproduces itself at every level of the hierarchy. Sauron used Saruman. He showed Saruman selected visions through the Palantir. He manipulated Saruman's perceptions. He exploited Saruman's pride and Saruman's fear and Saruman's ambition to turn the wizard from an opponent into a tool. Sauron treated Saruman not as a partner, but as a resource, a capable being whose capabilities could be redirected from the service of good to the service of evil. Saruman used Wormtongue in exactly the same way. He recruited Wormtongue with promises of power and reward. He placed Wormtongue in the court of Rohan as an instrument of manipulation. He used Wormtongue's weaknesses, his ambition, his lust for Owen, his resentment of his own mediocrity, as leverage, as tools, as points of entry through which Saruman's influence could be injected into the political body of Rohan. The parallel is precise. Sauron manipulated Saruman through the Palantir. Saruman manipulated Thodin through Wormtongue. The same method, the same indirect, deniable, psychologically informed method of influence, reproduced at a different scale with different actors, producing the same result: the corruption of a leader, the weakening of a defense, the substitution of the manipulator's will for the victim's. The recursion tells us something important. Corruption is not a single event. It is a process that generates copies of itself. The corrupted becomes the corrupter. The manipulated becomes the manipulator. The victim becomes the perpetrator. Saruman was corrupted by Sauron and then corrupted Wormtongue. Wormtongue was corrupted by Saruman and then corrupted Thodin. Each act of corruption produces a new agent of corruption, and the chain extends, link by link, victim by victim, until the corruption has spread through the entire system. And the recursion explains why Wormtongue kills Saruman. The master-servant relationship that Saruman established with Wormtongue was modelled on the master-servant relationship that Sauron established with Saruman. Both relationships were built on the same foundation: the exploitation of the servant's weaknesses, the use of the servant as a tool, the treatment of the servant as a means rather than an end. And the foundation, in both cases, is unstable. The servant who is used will eventually turn, will eventually reach the limit of what abuse can be endured, and the turning, when it comes, will be violent. Sauron's ring was destroyed by a creature he used and discarded. Saruman was killed by a servant he used and abused. The pattern is the same. Domination creates the conditions for its own destruction. The tool turns in the hand. Part 39. What Gandalf learned. Gandalf's encounter with Saruman at Orthanc was, I think, one of the formative experiences of Gandalf's entire career in Middle-earth, and the lessons that Gandalf took from the encounter shaped his approach to the War of the Ring in ways that are easy to overlook. Gandalf learned that intelligence is not protection. Saruman was the most intelligent being in the Astari Order, and Saruman's intelligence was not enough to protect him from corruption. The lesson was clear. Trust in one's own understanding is a vulnerability, not a strength. The smarter you are, the more elaborate your self-deceptions will be, and the harder it will be for others to detect them. Gandalf learned that the study of evil is dangerous. Saruman had studied the rings with a thoroughness that no other being could match, and the study had consumed him, had drawn him into the mental world of the enemy, had familiarized him with the methods of domination until the methods became attractive, had turned the scholar into the practitioner. Gandalf, who also studied the rings, would have seen in Saruman's fate a warning about the limits of his own research, a reminder that understanding evil and being corrupted by evil are separated by a thinner line than the scholar would like to believe. Gandalf learned that the small matters. Saruman dismissed hobbits, dismissed the ordinary, dismissed everything that did not register on his scale of strategic significance, and Saruman was destroyed by the things he dismissed. Gandalf took the opposite lesson: the small matters, the ordinary matters. The beings that the powerful overlook are the beings that change the world. And Gandalf built his entire strategy for the War of the Ring on this lesson, entrusting the ring to hobbits, betting the fate of the world on the courage and the goodness of the small rather than the power and the wisdom of the great. Gandalf learned that humility saves. Saruman's pride destroyed him. Gandalf's humility, his willingness to admit fear, to seek help, to trust beings that his own understanding could not fully account for, saved him. The lesson was personal and permanent. The wizard who admits that he does not know everything is the wizard who survives. Part 40. The Stages of the Fall. Let me lay out the stages of Saruman's fall clearly, because the progression is precise and the precision is important. Stage 1. Confidence. Kurumo accepts the mission with the certainty that his abilities are equal to the task. The certainty is not unreasonable. Kurumo is capable, knowledgeable, accomplished, but the certainty contains a vulnerability, the absence of doubt. Stage 2. Resentment. Saruman arrives in Middle-earth and discovers that others, Círdan, Galadriel, do not share his high opinion of himself. They prefer Gandalf. They give Gandalf the gifts and the trust that Saruman expected to receive. The resentment plants itself and begins to grow. Stage 3. Isolation. Saruman settles in Orthanc and begins to build his own domain, a controlled environment, ordered according to his design, insulated from the voices and the perspectives that might challenge his conclusions. The tower becomes a symbol, the being who is above, looking down, separated from the world he is supposed to serve. Stage 4. Obsession. Saruman's study of the rings consumes him. The study shifts from research to covetousness. Saruman begins to search for the One Ring, not to destroy it, but to use it. Stage 5. Sabotage. Saruman uses his position as head of the White Council to protect his private agenda, delaying the attack on Dol Guldur, redirecting the Council's attention, undermining the collective effort in order to preserve his individual ambition. Stage 6. Contact. Saruman uses the Palantir and encounters Sauron. The encounter does not suddenly corrupt him. The groundwork has been laid over centuries, but the Palantir accelerates the process, feeding Saruman's fears and confirming his conviction that Sauron cannot be defeated. Stage 7. Capitulation. Saruman accepts the logic of surrender. He concludes that joining Sauron is the rational response to an unwinnable situation. The capitulation is dressed in the language of pragmatism, but it is, at its core, the surrender of principle to expediency. Stage 8. Transformation. Saruman becomes the thing he was sent to fight. He builds an army, he corrupts leaders, he produces weapons of war, he transforms Isengard from a place of learning into a factory of destruction. Stage 9. Defeat. Saruman is beaten by Gandalf, by the Ents, by the hobbits, by the very forces he dismissed as insignificant. The defeat strips him of everything: his army, his fortress, his rank, his staff. Stage 10. Degradation. Saruman descends to the Shire. The once great wizard becomes a petty tyrant, bullying hobbits, ruining gardens, destroying the beauty of the land he was supposed to protect. Stage 11. Rejection. Saruman refuses mercy. He refuses redemption. He chooses spite over repentance, pride over humility, death over the admission that he was wrong. Stage 12. Dissolution. Saruman dies. His spirit is rejected by the West. His body decays. The being who was chosen for the greatest mission of the Third Age ends as a footnote, a ruined husk on the doorstep of Bag End, denied even the dignity of a return to the place of his origin. Part 41. Why it had to end in the Shire. The Scouring of the Shire is the correct ending for Saruman's story, and the reason it is correct reveals something essential about Tolkien's understanding of evil. Saruman's story could have ended at Orthanc. It could have ended with the breaking of the staff, with the humiliation before Gandalf, with the loss of rank and power and authority. That would have been a satisfying conclusion. The fallen wizard, stripped of his position, left to contemplate his failures in his ruined tower. But that ending would have been incomplete. It would have left the impression that evil is something that happens far away, in towers and fortresses and dark lands, in places that ordinary people never visit. It would have preserved the comforting illusion that evil is the province of the powerful, and that the ordinary world is safe from its reach. The Scouring of the Shire destroys this illusion. The Scouring says, evil comes home. Evil does not stay in Mordor. Evil does not confine itself to the battlefield. Evil follows you back to your front door, to your garden, to the places you love most and the places you assumed were safe. The war is not over when the armies go home. The war continues, in the fields and the lanes and the living rooms of the ordinary world, in the places where the damage is most personal and the loss is most felt. Saruman in the Shire is evil made domestic. Evil made ordinary. Evil scaled down from the cosmic to the quotidian, from the world threatening to the garden destroying, from the army commanding to the tree cutting, from the ring of power to the petty regulation. The Scouring shows us that the same impulse that builds Barad Doctor also tears down the party tree. The same desire that forges the One Ring also destroys the old mill and replaces it with a factory. The same corruption that turns a Mire into a Dark Lord also turns a wizard into a bully. The scaling down is the point. Tolkien is showing us that evil is not extraordinary. Evil is ordinary. Evil is the neighbor who poisons the stream, the official who cuts down the trees, the bureaucrat who imposes unnecessary rules, the petty tyrant who makes the lives of the people around him slightly worse every day. Evil is not always the eye of Sauron. Evil is sometimes Sharky in the Shire. Part 42. Saruman and Tolkien's world. Saruman's fall resonates with Tolkien on a personal level, with Tolkien's own experiences, his own fears, his own understanding of the world and its dangers. Tolkien was an academic. He was a scholar. He spent his career surrounded by brilliant, knowledgeable, intellectually accomplished people. people who trusted their own understanding, who valued their own expertise, who believed that their intelligence was a sufficient guide to truth. Tolkien knew from the inside the temptations of the intellectual life, the temptation to believe that knowing more means understanding better, that expertise confers wisdom, that the person with the most information is the person best equipped to make the right decisions. Saruman is Tolkien's warning to himself. Saruman is the scholar who becomes so absorbed in his subject that he loses his moral bearings. Saruman is the expert who trusts his analysis so completely that he cannot recognize its limitations. Saruman is the brilliant mind that mistakes intelligence for wisdom and knowledge for understanding and capability for goodness. Tolkien also saw in his own lifetime the consequences of knowledge without wisdom. He saw the industrialization of the English countryside, the destruction of forests, the pollution of streams, the replacement of gardens with factories, the systematic ruination of the natural world in the name of progress and efficiency. He saw the First World War, the industrial-scale application of human ingenuity to the task of killing. He saw in real time the fruits of a civilization that valued knowledge and capability above all else and that forgot, in its pursuit of mastery, the moral foundations that should have governed the use of that mastery. Saruman is the literary expression of these observations. Saruman is what happens when the maker forgets the purpose of making, when the builder forgets the purpose of building, when the scholar forgets the purpose of scholarship, when the wizard forgets the purpose of wizardry. The gifts remain, the skills remain, the capability remains. But the purpose is gone, replaced by ambition, by vanity, by the desire to master for mastery's sake, and the gifts, without purpose, become weapons. Tools of destruction rather than creation. Instruments of domination rather than service. Isengard under Saruman is the Shire's dark twin. And it is also, I think, Tolkien's vision of what his beloved English countryside would look like if the industrial impulse were allowed to proceed without restraint. The felling of the trees, the blackening of the air, the poisoning of the water, the replacement of the green and the growing with the grey and the grinding. Saruman's Isengard is the industrial revolution stripped of its justifications and presented in its naked ugliness, the transformation of a garden into a factory, carried out by a being who was too clever to see the beauty he was destroying and too proud to listen to the voices that told him to stop. Part 43. The Mando's Question. What happened to Saruman's spirit after the wind blew it away? Tolkien does not tell us, and the silence is, I think, deliberate. In Tolkien's cosmology, the spirits of the dead go to the halls of Mandos, the place of waiting, the domain of the Vala Enmo, where spirits rest and are judged before being released into whatever fate awaits them. Mortal spirits pass through Mandos and leave the world, departing beyond the circles of E, going to a destination that even the Valar do not know. Immortal spirits, the elves, the Maya, remain in Mandos or are eventually released and return to life. Saruman was a Maya. His spirit was immortal. His spirit should have gone to Mandos, should have returned to the divine realm, should have been subject to the judgment and the mercy of the Valar. But the wind from the west refused him. The spirit was blown away, dissipated, dissolved, scattered into nothing. What does this mean? It could mean that Saruman's spirit was destroyed, that the corruption was so total, so complete, so absolute that there was nothing left to save. The Maya essence was consumed by the corruption. The divine spark was extinguished. The being that was Kurumo ceased to exist. Or it could mean something else. It could mean that Saruman's spirit persists, diminished, formless, homeless, wandering the world without body and without purpose, a ghost of a ghost. an echo of an echo, a presence that is too weak to act and too corrupt to rest, a being that cannot die because it is immortal and cannot live because it has lost everything that makes existence meaningful. Either way, the ending is bleak. The being who was chosen for the greatest mission of the age ends either in annihilation or in eternal diminishment. The Maya who was sent to save the world is either destroyed by his own corruption or condemned to wander forever in the aftermath of his failure. Part 44. The film Saruman. Peter Jackson's portrayal of Saruman, brought to life by the extraordinary Christopher Lee, captures many aspects of the character brilliantly but misses one that is, I think, essential. The film captures Saruman's power. The voice is present. The seductive, commanding, irresistible quality of Saruman's speech, delivered with Lee's magnificent baritone. The film captures Saruman's menace, the cold, calculating, strategically brilliant villain who marshals armies and breeds monsters and threatens the free peoples with destruction. The film captures Saruman's ambition, the desire for the ring, the aspiration to replace Sauron, the conviction that he deserves to rule. But the film misses the degradation. The film misses the scouring of the Shire, the final, most important stage of Saruman's fall, the stage at which the once great wizard is reduced to petty tyranny and spite. Jackson cut the scouring because the film was already long, and because the scouring, in cinematic terms, felt like an anticlimax after the destruction of the ring. The decision was understandable from a filmmaking perspective, but it was devastating from a storytelling perspective. Without the scouring, Saruman's story is incomplete. Without the scouring, we do not see the full arc, the descent from Maya to bully, from the head of the Astari to Sharky, from the counselor of kings to the tyrant of gardeners. Without the scouring, Saruman remains a figure of power, diminished, yes, defeated, yes, but still recognizably powerful, still operating at a scale that is impressive even in failure. The scouring shows us what happens after the power is gone. The scouring shows us the man without the mask, the being underneath the authority, the person that the power was hiding. And what it shows us is not impressive. It is pathetic. It is the specific, deliberate, carefully calibrated pathos of a great being reduced to smallness. The scouring matters because the pathos matters. The pathos is the lesson. The lesson is not look how powerful the villain was. The lesson is look how small the villain became. The lesson is that pride does not end in a blaze of glory. It ends in a knife in the back, in a road outside Bag End, in the contempt of hobbits. Part 45. The Gandalf contrast. The full meaning of Saruman's fall becomes clear only when you set it against Gandalf's rise. The two arcs are mirror images, inverse trajectories that illuminate each other through their opposition. Gandalf begins with fear, Saruman begins with confidence. Gandalf serves the small, Saruman serves himself. Gandalf seeks allies, Saruman accumulates power. Gandalf admits what he does not know. Saruman assumes he knows everything. Gandalf dies and is sent back, elevated, empowered, given the authority that Saruman forfeited. Saruman is defeated and descends, stripped, diminished, reduced to the degraded state that his choices created. Gandalf ends his story at the Grey Havens, sailing west, returning to the Blessed Realm, welcomed home by the powers that sent him. Saruman ends his story at Bag End, dying in the road, his spirit rejected by the west, blown away by the wind from the Blessed Realm that will not take him back. The contrast is total. Every point of Gandalf's arc has a corresponding point in Saruman's, and every corresponding point shows the opposite result. The wizard who was humble was elevated. The wizard who was proud was destroyed. The wizard who loved the small saved the world. The wizard who despised the small was defeated by it. The contrast tells us what Tolkien believed about the nature of goodness and the nature of evil, about the qualities that save and the qualities that destroy. Goodness is not intelligence. Goodness is not knowledge. Goodness is not capability. Goodness is humility. Goodness is the willingness to admit that you are not enough, that you need help, that you need others, that the beings next to you have something to offer that your own gifts cannot supply. Saruman had everything except humility. And the everything without humility was worth less than the nothing with humility. Gandalf, with his pipeweed and his hobbit friends, and his fireworks and his fear of the dark, was worth more, infinitely, incalculably more, than Saruman with his tower and his army and his ring lore and his voice. The contrast is Tolkien's verdict: humility wins. Always, even when it does not look like it will, even when the mathematics say otherwise, even when the rational analysis concludes that it cannot. Humility wins because the world was made by a being who values humility, and the world, in the end, reflects the values of its maker. Part 46. The Tragedy. Saruman's story is a tragedy, a genuine, classical, Aristotelian tragedy. The fall of a great being through the fatal flaw that is inseparable from the being's greatness. The greatness is real. Saruman was genuinely great, knowledgeable, capable, accomplished, a being of extraordinary gifts who could have been one of the most important forces for good in the history of Middle-earth. The greatness is not an illusion. It is not a facade. It is the real foundation on which the tragedy is built, because tragedy requires greatness. The fall of a mediocre being is not tragic. It is merely sad. The fall of a great being is tragic, because the fall destroys something that was genuinely valuable, something that the world needed, something that cannot be replaced. The flaw is inseparable from the greatness. Saruman's pride was not an add-on, not a defect that could have been removed without changing the rest of the character. Saruman's pride was the dark side of his capability. The confidence that drove his accomplishments was the same confidence that blinded him to his errors. The ambition that fueled his achievements was the same ambition that corrupted his purpose. The intelligence that made him the most knowledgeable being in Middle-earth was the same intelligence that produced the rationalizations that justified his betrayal. The tragedy is that the flaw could not be removed without removing the greatness. Saruman could not have been less proud without being less capable. He could not have been more humble without being less driven. The qualities that made him great and the qualities that destroyed him were the same qualities, the same impulses, the same drives, the same essential characteristics, pointed in different directions by the choices that the being made. The tragedy is also that the fall was preventable. At every stage, at every one of the 12 stages that I outlined earlier, Saruman had a choice. He could have chosen differently. He could have accepted Gandalf's counsel. He could have resisted the Palantir. He could have admitted his errors. He could have accepted mercy. At every stage, the door was open. At every stage, the option of repentance was available. And at every stage, Saruman chose pride. The preventability is what makes it tragic rather than merely pathetic. Saruman was not doomed. He was not fated. He was not predetermined to fall. He fell because he chose to fall, because at every opportunity for correction, he chose the path that preserved his self-image over the path that would have required him to change. The tragedy is the accumulation of choices, each one small, each one understandable, each one defensible in isolation, and all of them together producing the catastrophe. Part 47. The Ring He Never Made. Saruman called himself Saruman Ring Maker. The title is important, not because Saruman successfully made a ring of power, but because the aspiration reveals the ultimate destination of his corruption. Saruman wanted to make a ring. He wanted to create an artifact of domination, a device that would impose his will on the world, that would give him the power to order reality according to his design, that would make him, in the most literal sense, the master of all he surveyed. The aspiration is the final expression of the craft impulse gone wrong. All made the dwarves out of a desire to create, to share, to bring new beings into the world. Sauron made the One Ring out of a desire to dominate, to control, to impose his will on every other will. And Saruman, standing between these two poles, between the creative and the destructive, between the gift of all and the sin of Sauron, aspired to the ring. He chose the ring over the dwarf. He chose domination over creation. He chose Sauron's path over Ol's. The ring he never made is the symbol of his fall, the object that represents, in a single, concentrated image, everything that went wrong with Saruman's character. The ring is power without purpose, mastery without wisdom, craft without love. The ring is what happens when the builder forgets why he builds, when the goal of building becomes the building itself, when the creation exists to serve the creator rather than the world. Saruman never made his ring. But the aspiration was enough. The desire for the ring, the willingness to contemplate the creation of an instrument of domination, the mental crossing of the line between understanding evil and embracing it, was the final, irrevocable step in the fall. Everything after the aspiration was consequence. Everything before was preparation. The aspiration was the moment, the true moment of Saruman's fall, the instant when the Maya of all became, in his heart if not in his achievement, a second Sauron. Part 48. The Shear as Mirror. The Shear, under Saruman's rule, is a miniature Mordor, and the miniaturization is the point. Consider the parallels. In Mordor, Sauron's forces destroy the natural landscape, turning fertile land into ash plains, poisoning the water, burning the vegetation, creating a wasteland that serves the war machine. In the Shire, Saruman's agents do the same thing at a smaller scale, cutting down trees, polluting the stream, demolishing homes, replacing the mill with a factory that produces nothing useful and fouls the air. In Mordor, Sauron imposes total control, surveillance, regulation, the suppression of individual freedom, the subordination of every aspect of life to the will of the master. In the Shire, Saruman does the same, posting rules, restricting movement, rationing food, creating a petty police state that monitors the hobbits' activities and punishes any deviation from the imposed order. In Mordor, Sauron uses orcs as his enforcers. In the Shire, Saruman uses half-orcs and corrupted men, beings who are, in their own way, as wretched and as pitiable as the orcs of Mordor. Beings who have been recruited or coerced into the service of a master who does not value them. The Shire, under Saruman, is Mordor in miniature. And the miniaturization is Tolkien's way of showing us that the principle is the same at every scale. The impulse that builds Barad-dûr is the same impulse that destroys Bagshot Row. The desire that forges the One Ring is the same desire that imposes unnecessary regulations on the distribution of pipeweed. The evil is the same evil. The only difference is the scale. And the scale, Tolkien is telling us, does not matter. Evil is evil, whether it is committed by the Dark Lord of Mordor or by an old man calling himself Sharky in the lanes of the Shire. Part 49. What could have saved him? The question hangs over Saruman's entire story. What could have saved him? The answer is not complicated. It is, in fact, devastatingly simple, admitting he was wrong. At any point, at any stage in the long, step-by-step, century-spanning process of his corruption, Saruman could have stopped. He could have looked at what he was becoming and said, "This is not what I was sent here to be." He could have looked at his actions and said, "This is not what I was sent here to do." He could have looked at the consequences of his choices and said, "I have made a mistake, and I need to change." The admission would have been painful. It would have required the dismantling of the self-image that Saruman had spent centuries constructing, the image of the infallible analyst, the supreme strategist, the being whose judgment was always correct and whose conclusions were always sound. Admitting that he was wrong would have meant admitting that the image was false, that Saruman was not the being he believed himself to be, that his confidence was not justified, that his certainty was not warranted. The admission would have been humiliating. It would have meant accepting the judgment of beings he considered inferior, accepting that Círdan was right to give Narya to Gandalf, that Galadriel was right to prefer Gandalf for the leadership of the Council, that the hobbits and the elves and the ordinary people of Middle-earth were right to trust Gandalf more than they trusted Saruman. The humiliation would have been total, a complete, public, irrevocable acknowledgement that Saruman's entire career had been built on a false foundation. But the admission would have saved him. The humiliation would have been the beginning of redemption. The dismantling of the false self-image would have created space for a true self-image, a more honest, more accurate, more humble understanding of who Saruman actually was and what he was actually capable of. The admission of error would have been the first step toward correction. The acknowledgement of weakness would have been the first step toward genuine strength. Saruman could not take this step. The price was too high. The humiliation was too great. The self-image was too precious. Saruman preferred ruin to honesty, preferred the slow, grinding, decade-by-decade descent from Kurumo to Shaki over the single, devastating, liberating moment of admitting that he had been wrong all along. Part 50. The Two Smiths. Let me return to where we started, to the blessed realm, to the service of all, to the two Maya who were shaped by the same impulses and who took those impulses in opposite directions. Sauron and Saruman. The two smiths. The two craftsmen. The two beings whose nature was oriented toward making and ordering and mastering, and who turned the making into domination, the ordering into tyranny, the mastering into enslavement. Sauron's fall was older and more complete. Sauron fell in the Elder Days, corrupted by Morgoth, drawn into the service of the first Dark Lord, turned from a craftsman into a warlord. Sauron's fall was dramatic, cosmic, the corruption of an angelic spirit by the embodiment of cosmic evil. Sauron's fall produced the greatest villain of the Third Age, the Dark Lord, the maker of the One Ring, the Eye of Barad-dûrtr. Saruman's fall was newer and more intimate. Saruman fell in the Third Age, corrupted not by Morgoth but by himself, drawn not into the service of an external Dark Lord but into the service of his own ambition. Saruman's fall was quiet, gradual, the corruption of a good being by the accumulation of small compromises and self-serving rationalizations. Saruman's fall produced not a Dark Lord but a petty tyrant, a bully, a thug, a being whose ambitions exceeded his capabilities and whose capabilities, once stripped of their divine backing, were not sufficient to sustain even the modest level of power he aspired to in the Shire. The two falls are the same fall, told at different scales. And the smaller scale is, in some ways, the more frightening, because the smaller scale is the scale at which most corruption happens. Most people who lose their way do not do so through a cosmic drama of angelic rebellion. They do so through the quiet, gradual, day-by-day accumulation of small compromises, The same process that turned Kurumo into Sharky. One step at a time, one rationalization at a time, one refusal to admit error at a time. Saruman's fall is more relatable than Sauron's because it is more human. Sauron is a force of nature, a being whose corruption is so vast and so complete that it operates on a scale that ordinary experience cannot encompass. Saruman is a person, a being whose corruption is specific, individual, psychologically precise, and terrifyingly recognizable to anyone who has ever watched a brilliant person convince themselves that they are too smart to be wrong. Part 51. The Last Lesson. Tolkien's last lesson about Saruman is delivered at the doorstep of Bag End, in the moment of the wizard's death, in the image of the spirit rising and the wind blowing from the west. The lesson is this: there is a point beyond which redemption, while theoretically possible, becomes practically unreachable. Not because the offer is withdrawn, not because the mercy runs out, not because the divine powers that could save you have decided that you are beyond saving, but because you, the person, the spirit, the being who needs to be saved, have lost the capacity to accept the saving. Saruman was offered mercy, twice by Gandalf at Orthanc and by Frodo at Bag End. The mercy was genuine. The offer was real. The door was open, but Saruman could not walk through it, because walking through it required the one thing that Saruman could no longer do: bend. Submit. Admit that the being offering mercy possessed something that Saruman needed. The point of no return was not a moment. It was a process, the same process that defined the entire fall. Each refusal made the next refusal easier. Each reinforcement of pride made the next opportunity for humility harder to grasp. Each step down the path of corruption moved the point of no return a little closer, until the point was reached and passed, and the being on the other side was no longer capable of the choice that could have saved him. The wind from the west is the Valar's acknowledgement of this reality. The wind does not refuse Saruman's spirit because the Valar are vindictive. The wind refuses the spirit because there is nothing to refuse, nothing left to save, nothing left to redeem, nothing left of the being who was sent to Middle-earth except the empty shell of a pride that consumed everything it touched. Part 52. The Arc Complete. Kurumo, a spirit of light, shaped by the greatest maker in the blessed realm, gifted with knowledge and skill and the capacity for extraordinary service. Saruman, a wizard in Middle-earth, charged with the sacred mission of opposing the darkness, given the highest rank and the greatest trust, positioned at the center of the effort to save the world. Saruman of many colors. A fallen wizard corrupted by pride and ambition and the slow, insidious erosion of purpose, studying the enemy so thoroughly that he became the enemy, gazing so long into the abyss that the abyss consumed him. Sharky, a bully. A thug. A petty tyrant ruling over a kingdom of hobbits, cutting down trees and poisoning streams and imposing regulations on pipeweed, the last and the least expression of a corruption that once aspired to cosmic significance. A body on a road. A spirit in the wind. A name that no one will remember with honor. The arc is complete. From the Blessed Realm to Bag End, from All's workshop to the doorstep of a hobbit hole, from the greatest mission of the age to the pettiest tyranny imaginable. The distance between the beginning and the end is the measure of the fall, and the fall is as great as the beginning was high. Part 53. Why it matters. Saruman's story matters because Saruman's story is not finished. The pattern that produced Saruman is still producing Sarumans, in every age, in every culture, in every institution that values intelligence over wisdom and capability over humility. The Saruman pattern is this: A gifted being receives a mission. The being pursues the mission with confidence. The confidence becomes pride. The pride becomes isolation. The isolation becomes obsession. The obsession becomes corruption. The corruption becomes collaboration with the very evil that the being was sent to oppose. And the collaboration eventually becomes identity. The being becomes the evil, becomes indistinguishable from the evil, becomes a new instance of the pattern that produced the original evil. The pattern is recognizable. We have all seen it. In leaders who lose their way, in institutions that forget their purpose, in movements that become the thing they were fighting against. The Saruman pattern is the pattern of corrupted purpose, the universal, recurring, seemingly inevitable process by which the defender becomes the tyrant, the protector becomes the predator, the servant becomes the master. Tolkien saw this pattern. He named it. He gave it a face and a story and a name. And he offered, through the contrast with Gandalf, the antidote, humility. The willingness to admit fear, the willingness to serve the small, the willingness to trust the unlikely, the willingness to say, I do not know enough, and to mean it and to act on it, by seeking help, by valuing others, by remaining open to the possibility that the being standing next to you, however small and however afraid, might see something that you cannot. Part 54. The Wind from the West. Let me close with the final image. The image that Tolkien uses to end Saruman's story, and that I think is one of the most haunting images in all of literature. Saruman lies dead in the road. His body is decaying, rapidly, visibly, as though all the years of sustained existence are catching up at once. The mortal form that carried Amaya's spirit for 2,000 years is collapsing into itself, becoming the husk that it always was underneath the divine animation. And the spirit rises. Thin, grey, insubstantial, a column of mist shaped like a man, lifting from the body, rising into the air. The spirit pauses. It turns. It looks toward the west, toward the sea, toward the blessed realm, toward the place where it began. The place where Kurumo was shaped by Ol and sent on the mission that would define and destroy him. The spirit looks west because the west is home. Despite everything, despite the pride and the betrayal and the corruption and the degradation, the spirit remembers. The spirit knows where it came from. The spirit knows, in the deepest and most fundamental part of its being, that the west is where it belongs. And the wind comes, cold and clear, blowing from the direction of the sea, blowing from the west, blowing from the blessed realm, from the land of the Valar, from the home that Kurumo left 2,000 years ago and that Sharki can never return to. The wind catches the spirit bends, the spirit wavers. And then the spirit dissolves, blown apart by the wind, scattered by the breath of the divine, dispersed into the air like smoke, like fog, like the last trace of a fire that has burned itself out. The hobbits watch. They see the spirit rise and turn and dissolve. They see the body collapse. And then they turn away, back to their homes, back to their gardens, back to the work of rebuilding the Shire that Saruman ruined. The hobbits turn away, and the story continues, and the wind blows, and the spirit is gone. And the being who was Kurumo, who was Saruman, who was Sharki, who was nothing, is nothing. The wind from the west is the last word. It is the sound of the door closing. It is the sound of the blessed realm saying, "You were given everything, and you chose to throw it away, and now the choice is permanent, and now the fall is complete, and now the story is over. Thank you for spending this evening with me." Saruman's fall is not a tale about a distant villain in a distant world. It is a tale about the danger that lives inside every gift. The danger that the very things that make us capable are the things that can destroy us, if they are not tempered by the one quality that does not look like a strength, but that is, in the end, the only strength that matters. Humility saved Gandalf. Pride destroyed Saruman. And the difference between them, the simple, unsexy, unimpressive difference between admitting fear and denying it, was the difference between saving the world and ruining it. Until next time.